My name is Olivia. I am 33 years old. My mother-in-law demanded my most precious jewelry right in the middle of a crowded elite country club dinner, fully expecting me to surrender it like a compliant, obedient servant with no will of her own. But just as she reached across the table to rip it from my neck, my security team materialized out of the shadows. The entire dining room plunged into a suffocating dead silence as her breathtaking entitlement collided with a reality she had never once considered possible. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family member who severely underestimated you and deliberately tried to treat you like you were worth absolutely nothing. The Oakwood Country Club was precisely the kind of place that reeked of expensive cigar smoke, aged leather, and suffocating, desperate pretension. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables full of people who had spent their entire lives performing the exhausting sport of proving exactly how much money they had accumulated. I was seated at the best VIP table right in the center of the main dining room, wearing a simple but elegantly understated black evening gown. I felt genuinely out of place among these people, but I had agreed to come as a gesture of goodwill toward my husband, Brandon. I was quietly sipping my sparkling water when his mother, Patricia, decided the moment had arrived to make her move. She set her silver fork down with a loud, deliberate clank that echoed sharply over the soft jazz drifting in the background. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger straight at my chest. "Take that off right now, Olivia," she commanded. Her voice was intentionally sharp and loud enough that the couple seated at the next table actually stopped their conversation just to look over at us. "Take it off and hand it to me immediately." I blinked in genuine confusion, slowly lowering my water glass to the table. My eyes dropped to the deep blue sapphire and diamond necklace resting heavily against my collarbone. "What on earth are you talking about, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured so as not to create an unnecessary scene. "Do not play dumb with me," she snapped, leaning forward so aggressively she nearly toppled her expensive wine glass. "Audrey is celebrating her 5th wedding anniversary next week. She needs a statement piece to wear to the hospital gala. That sapphire will look absolutely stunning on her. You never wear it anyway. And honestly, a piece of high society jewelry like that is completely wasted on a computer repair girl." A computer repair girl. That was how she always described me to her wealthy social circle. Patricia was absolutely consumed by the concept of old money and relentless social climbing. She devoted every waking moment to performing the elaborate role of a prestigious matriarch descended from a long and distinguished line of wealthy aristocrats. She looked down with open contempt on anyone who actually had to work for a living, and she harbored a particularly deep loathing for the fact that her precious son had chosen to marry a woman who had built her entire career from the ground up with her own hands. In her limited imagination, because my company dealt with software and digital networks, I was essentially a glorified help desk technician with delusions of grandeur. She had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most respected cybersecurity and digital forensics firms in the entire nation. She genuinely believed my long hours were spent hunched over broken laptops, not securing massive government contracts, and protecting sensitive corporate data from sophisticated international hackers. And because I never felt any need to broadcast my success or flaunt my financial standing, she had comfortably concluded that I was practically penniless. She constantly reminded me how extraordinarily fortunate I was that her son had elevated my social standing simply by agreeing to marry me. It was a profoundly rich joke, considering that I was the one secretly paying the thousands of dollars required to maintain her country club membership every single month, just to preserve some fragile semblance of family peace. But tonight was not the evening to unveil my financial portfolio. Tonight was simply and entirely about establishing firm boundaries. I drew a slow, steadying breath, refusing to allow her condescending words to crack my composure. "No," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I am not removing this necklace, and I am certainly not giving it to Audrey." Patricia gasped loudly, as though I had physically slapped her across the face. "Excuse me?" she sputtered, her complexion turning an unflattering shade of crimson. "This is a family emergency, Olivia. Audrey needs to look the part of a successful doctor's wife. She has a high-class image to maintain in front of her peers. I am not asking you. I am telling you. Give me that necklace right now." I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and held my ground. "Patricia, this necklace belonged to my late mother. It is the only physical connection I have left to her memory. It is not a costume accessory for your daughter to parade around in to impress people she does not even genuinely like. It stays exactly where it belongs." I had naively assumed that my clearly stated boundary would settle the matter entirely. I had severely underestimated her extraordinary capacity for entitlement and her insatiable hunger for control. Patricia slammed both palms flat on the table and rose to her feet. The violent scraping of her heavy wooden chair against the marble floor immediately drew the attention of half the dining room. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the air like electricity. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," she shouted, her voice abandoning entirely the refined, cultivated tone she typically performed for public consumption. "My son brought you into this beautiful world of extreme luxury. We gave you a seat at this prestigious table. You owe this entire family absolutely everything you have. You do not get to sit here consuming our expensive food while denying my daughter what she rightfully deserves. Hand over that sapphire necklace right now before I reach across this table and tear it off your neck myself." I turned my gaze deliberately toward my husband. Brandon was sitting to my right, swirling a measure of expensive Cabernet in his crystal glass, with the detached ease of a man who believed the situation was already resolved in his favor. I waited for him to speak. I waited for the man who had once vowed to protect and cherish me to remind his mother that she had crossed an unforgivable line. In any healthy marriage, a husband would instinctively de-escalate. He would firmly and publicly declare that his late mother-in-law's heirloom was completely off-limits. He would defend his wife without hesitation against such a blatant and humiliating public assault. Instead, Brandon exhaled a slow, irritated sigh. He set his wineglass down and looked at me, not with support, not with compassion, but with the cold, dismissive annoyance of a teacher whose patience had been thoroughly exhausted. "Olivia, for heaven's sake, just take the necklace off and give it to her," Brandon said. His voice was smooth, polished, and dripping with practiced condescension. "Do not make a scene in front of my colleagues and clients. You know perfectly well how important this evening is for my networking and career advancement." I stared at him as the last remaining warmth I held for him drained completely from my body. Brandon was a wealth manager, a man whose entire existence was built upon projecting an image of immense prosperity and effortless control. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that I had quietly paid for, yet he sat there addressing me as though I were an ungrateful burden he was graciously tolerating. I asked him directly whether he was genuinely choosing to take his mother's side over my deceased mother's most treasured possession. He adjusted his silk tie, leaned in close, and dropped his voice to a harsh, commanding whisper designed entirely to pressure me into submission. "It is just a piece of jewelry, Olivia," he hissed, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "My sister Audrey is celebrating a major milestone. 5 years of marriage to Jamal is a significant achievement in our social circle. They have important appearances to maintain at the hospital gala, and they have been navigating a rough financial patch recently. It is your absolute duty to support this family." "Your duty." The phrase reverberated through my mind like a hammer strike. Brandon genuinely believed I owed them my most sacred and irreplaceable possession simply because I had been granted the supposed privilege of marrying into his family name. He continued his deeply insulting lecture, utterly blind to the cold, controlled fury quietly building behind my eyes. "When I brought you into this family," he continued, maintaining a plastic smile for the benefit of nearby tables, "we agreed that we would operate as a unified unit. Audrey needs that sapphire to complete her gala ensemble. It is a necessary investment in our family's collective public image. You sitting in a dark room typing on a keyboard all day does not require a diamond and sapphire pendant. Simply unhook the clasp and pass it to my mother. We can purchase you a nice cubic zirconia replacement sometime next week if you truly need something decorative to stare at while you fix computer bugs." The breathtaking audacity of that statement needed a moment to fully land. He was asking me to underwrite his sister's fabricated high society lifestyle by surrendering the last tangible piece of my heart. He was trivializing my grief, my mother's irreplaceable memory, and my entire existence as a human being, purely to appease his greedy, manipulative family. Emboldened by her son's unwavering support, Patricia's expression shifted into a predatory, triumphant smirk. "You see?" she sneered, her eyes gleaming with undisguised malice. "Even my own son recognizes how selfish you are being. You are behaving like a spoiled child who refuses to share her toys. Now stop throwing this pathetic tantrum and hand it over before I completely lose my patience." When I remained perfectly motionless, my hands resting calmly in my lap, her simmering impatience finally boiled over into something far uglier. Patricia pushed herself fully upright and lunged forward across the wide dining table, sending a crystal water goblet crashing onto its side. The ice water spread rapidly across the pristine white linen in an expanding dark stain. She did not spare it a single glance. Her diamond-laden hands, rings I had unknowingly financed, reached directly toward my throat. She was genuinely prepared to physically assault me in the middle of the Oakwood Country Club to tear a necklace from my body. She intended to physically dominate me in front of witnesses in order to establish her absolute authority over my life. She never made contact. Before Patricia's grasping fingers could reach my collarbone, a massive presence detached itself from the dim corner of the dining room. Gideon moved with a silent, controlled speed that completely defied his towering frame. My security chief did not carry a conspicuous earpiece or wear tactical clothing that might draw unnecessary attention. He wore a flawlessly tailored dark suit that allowed him to dissolve into the background of high society environments, waiting with infinite patience for precisely this type of moment. He materialized beside my chair like a shadow given sudden physical form. Without speaking a single word, Gideon intercepted Patricia's outstretched arm in midair, his massive hand enclosing her wrist like a steel vise with no give whatsoever. Patricia released a sharp gasp of shock, followed immediately by a genuine whimper of physical discomfort. Gideon did not strike her or push her violently. He applied a precise and calculated amount of pressure to specific nerve points while rotating her wrist backward at a deeply uncomfortable angle. The mechanical leverage forced Patricia to immediately retreat in order to relieve the sharp pain shooting up her arm. She stumbled backward, her knees buckling slightly as Gideon's firm grip guided her efficiently back into her heavy wooden dining chair. He held her arm pinned just long enough to ensure she was securely seated, then stepped back and positioned his considerable frame directly between her and me. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression an emotionless mask of carved stone, his cold gaze settling on Brandon with a warning that required no words whatsoever. The message was communicated purely through posture and proximity. Anyone who moved toward me would face immediate and devastating consequences. Gideon had spent years in special operations before I brought him onto my executive protection detail, and his ability to neutralize a physical threat without creating unnecessary collateral damage was genuinely without equal. He stood there like an immovable fixture, radiating a quiet and unmistakable danger that commanded absolute deference from every person within his orbit. The brief physical exchange had been swift, brutally precise, and completely impossible to dismiss. The ambient chatter of the country club evaporated instantly. The cheerful clinking of silverware against fine china fell completely silent. Waiters froze mid-step, silver trays suspended in midair. The soft jazz filtering through the hidden speakers suddenly felt deafeningly loud in the sudden void of human voices. The entire dining room had descended into a breathless, suffocating silence as dozens of corporate executives, prominent socialites, and wealthy patrons stared openly at our table. They had just watched the supposedly untouchable wealthy matriarch of the Oakwood Country Club be physically restrained by a professional bodyguard at her own dinner table. The carefully maintained illusion of their high society evening had been comprehensively shattered. The silence did not hold long. Patricia, recognizing that her performance of dominance had backfired magnificently, immediately pivoted to her most polished and well-rehearsed role, the fragile, helpless victim. She cradled her wrist against her chest and arranged her face into a portrait of exaggerated agony before releasing a piercing shriek that sliced cleanly through the lingering quiet, ensuring every eye in the room remained fixed on our table. "Assault!" she screamed, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. "Did everyone see that? This man just assaulted me. I am an elderly woman, and this brute nearly shattered my arm." She swept her eyes around the dining room in frantic appeal, desperately seeking validation from the wealthy onlookers. Her performance was genuinely award-worthy. She cradled her arm as though the bones had been ground to powder, casting terrified glances at Gideon, who remained standing behind me with the complete emotional detachment of a predator observing a panicked mouse. He did not react to her theatrics in even the smallest way. Brandon, incapable of tolerating his mother's public humiliation and enraged by the visible damage being done to his carefully curated social image, finally moved. He slammed his hands on the table, shot up from his chair, and directed the full force of his fury at Gideon and at me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he roared, his voice reverberating across the room. He jabbed a trembling finger toward Gideon. "You are fired. Collect your things and leave this club immediately before I have you arrested for assault." He turned his fury toward me, his chest heaving visibly. "And you, Olivia, how dare you bring hired muscle into my mother's country club? Who exactly do you think you are? Because you pay for a glorified driver, you believe he has the right to lay hands on my mother? You are going to apologize to her right now, and then you are going to hand over that necklace." He assumed Gideon was a low-level contracted employee, a rented driver or basic security guard I had hired to feel important at social functions. He had no concept of the reality that Gideon was a highly trained specialist, serving as the head of my company's full executive protection division, whose annual compensation likely exceeded Brandon's own inflated income by a significant margin. Brandon's ego was bleeding, and he was lashing out desperately, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority in front of an audience that mattered enormously to him. I did not flinch. I did not elevate my voice. I did not scramble to offer the frantic apologies he had fully anticipated. Instead, I simply reached for my wine glass, lifted it with a perfectly steady hand, and took a long, unhurried sip. I allowed the silence to stretch and expand, forcing both Brandon and Patricia to sit inside the uncomfortable wreckage of their own making. The deep red wine caught the light of the chandeliers in a way that felt almost ceremonial. "Gideon," I said softly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my husband. "Step back, please, but remain close." Gideon complied immediately, taking one smooth, fluid step backward and dissolving back into the periphery of the room. His presence remained a palpable and heavy weight in the atmosphere, close enough to intervene in a fraction of a second if the situation required it, but sufficiently distant to allow the conversation to proceed on its own terms. I set my wineglass back on the table. The delicate clink of crystal against linen sounded impossibly loud in the charged silence. I looked at Brandon with clear, steady eyes, seeing straight through the expensive suit and the arrogant facade, seeing the weak, entitled man concealed underneath. The man who would casually strip his wife of her mother's most precious memory, simply to appease a manipulative family that had never once genuinely respected him either. "Brandon," I began, my voice cool and precise, cutting cleanly through the lingering murmurs at the surrounding tables. "You appear to be operating under a profound misconception about how things actually function. You do not have the authority to terminate my staff. Gideon works for me." He responded exactly as he was trained to respond when someone attempts to physically assault his principal. Brandon's color deepened further. "She is my mother," he hissed through clenched teeth. "She was not going to hurt you. She just wanted the necklace." "And I said no," I replied, my tone completely unmoved. My answer was no. The fact that she felt entitled to escalate to physical violence in order to take something that does not belong to her is entirely her own problem. And the fact that you sat there and watched her attempt it tells me everything I will ever need to know about where your loyalties truly reside. Patricia, still performing her wrist injury for the benefit of the room, let out another theatrical sob. "She is completely unhinged, Brandon. Look at what she has done. She is trying to destroy this entire family." I ignored her performance entirely, keeping my attention squarely on my husband. "This entire evening," I continued, leaning slightly forward, "has been remarkably illuminating. I agreed to come here tonight to support you, to play the role of the devoted, presentable wife for your colleagues and clients. But I will not be bullied. I will not be physically attacked. And I will absolutely not be commanded to surrender my late mother's necklace so your sister can wear it to a party for people she does not even respect." I caught the flicker of genuine confusion crossing Brandon's face. He was not accustomed to hearing me speak with this kind of deliberate authority. Throughout the entire duration of our marriage, I had been accommodating, consistently willing to absorb his family's subtle cruelties and passive-aggressive behavior for the sake of maintaining some surface-level peace. I had played the role he had silently cast me in. That version of me no longer existed. "You are making a colossal mistake, Olivia," Brandon threatened, his voice dropping into a low, tightly controlled rumble. "You are humiliating me in front of people who define my professional future. You need to resolve this right now." "I am not the one who needs to resolve anything," I replied, settling back into my chair with complete composure. "You and your mother engineered this situation entirely on your own. The consequences are yours to absorb." I lifted my wineglass once more, my hand unwavering. The cold and methodical justice I had been quietly constructing for months was now beginning its careful unraveling, and I found myself entirely at peace, watching them disintegrate in real time. I was no longer the submissive wife they had taken for granted and weaponized against herself. I was the architect of their imminent unraveling, and they were far too blinded by their own arrogance to recognize the cliff they were standing on. Patricia's expression shifted with breathtaking speed, from her performance of manufactured suffering to a portrait of raw, uncontained fury. The dawning realization that her public spectacle had completely failed to break my composure sent her past any remaining threshold of self-control. She dropped her supposedly shattered wrist, miraculously healed in an instant, and drove both hands flat onto the table. Her chest heaved as she lurched forward, eyes wide and bloodshot, no longer making any effort to maintain the veneer of refinement she had spent decades constructing. The elite facade shattered right there in the VIP dining room of the Oakwood Country Club, crumbling into irretrievable pieces. She was no longer a sophisticated socialite commanding her empire. She was a desperate, exposed woman losing her grip on the only leverage she had ever truly possessed. "You arrogant, worthless little brat!" Patricia screamed, her shrill voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "You think you can humiliate me inside my own club? You think you hold any power in this dynamic whatsoever? I am the matriarch of this family, and you are nothing more than a common street rat that we took pity on. I will destroy you for this, Olivia. I will ensure Brandon files for divorce before tomorrow morning is over. I will have him throw you out of our luxury downtown penthouse before the sun has even finished setting. You will be packing your cheap computer repair tools into garbage bags and sleeping on the pavement. That penthouse belongs to my son. It belongs to our family's legacy. You will walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing, just the pathetic empty pockets you arrived with." The sheer magnificent delusion of her threat was almost comical. The luxury downtown penthouse she was screaming about, the sprawling multi-level residence with its panoramic views of the city skyline, had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with her son or any imagined family legacy. But I let her continue uninterrupted, allowing her to excavate her own grave deeper in front of the most influential executives and power brokers in the city. Every word she screamed was another nail in the coffin of her fabricated prestige. "That is exactly right," Audrey chimed in, leaning eagerly across the table with a practiced, vicious sneer. Audrey was the golden child, the perpetually indulged princess who had been raised to believe the universe owed her an endless supply of luxury without expectation. She was seated beside her husband, Jamal, a quietly respected orthopedic surgeon who was watching the entire exchange unfold with a deep, uncomfortable frown that suggested he had not signed up for any part of this evening. Audrey leveled a manicured finger at my black evening gown, her gaze heavy with performative contempt. "Look at you," she mocked, her voice honed to a razor's edge. "You do not belong in a place like this. That dress looks as though you pulled it off a clearance rack at a discount department store. You have zero class, zero style, and absolutely zero comprehension of what it means to be part of a prestigious lineage." She tossed her hair with practiced flair. "You should be on your knees thanking us every single day of your life," she continued, her voice climbing to match her mother's hysterical register. "We allowed a complete nobody to marry into one of the most respected families in this city. We gave you our name. We gave you access to our social circle. We extended you a seat at our table. The very least you could do is demonstrate some basic gratitude and hand over a piece of jewelry that you clearly do not have the pedigree to wear with any dignity. You are an embarrassment to my brother and a source of deep embarrassment to this entire family. Hand over the sapphire and remove yourself from our presence before we make it our personal mission to ruin you completely." Brandon sat alongside them, nodding with the fervent enthusiasm of a man who believed the combined assault would finally fracture my resolve. His chest swelled with hollow bravado. He was utterly convinced that the coordinated verbal attack from his mother and sister would break something fundamental inside me, that I would crumble, dissolve into tears, and frantically surrender the necklace just to stop the overwhelming public humiliation from continuing. That had always been their strategy: isolate their target, coordinate a concentrated barrage of emotional abuse, and rely entirely on the victim's desperate fear of public conflict to compel absolute submission. He watched me with cold, expectant eyes, waiting for the surrender he considered inevitable. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense, explanation, or justification. I sat in my chair with perfect posture, completely and visibly unmoved by every venomous word being hurled across the dining table. My breathing remained slow and even. I looked at Patricia's flushed and furious face, then at Audrey's sneering expression, and finally at Brandon's smug and anticipatory smirk. They were operating from a script I had already memorized and systematically dismantled months in advance. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and retrieved my designer handbag. It was a custom, limited edition piece whose price tag exceeded what Brandon earned in an entire quarter, though his family entirely lacked the discernment to recognize its value. The simple, deliberate movement drew the immediate attention of everyone at the table. Patricia stopped breathing quite so loudly. Audrey narrowed her eyes, tracking my hands with sharp suspicion. Brandon leaned back, a triumphant smile spreading slowly across his face, clearly assuming I was reaching inside for a jewelry box, finally surrendering the necklace as they had demanded. Instead of a jewelry box, my hand closed around something considerably heavier and infinitely more consequential. I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with my husband as I slowly withdrew my hand from the bag. Gideon stood motionless behind me, his presence ensuring that no one at the table would dare make any sudden movement toward what I was about to place before them. I withdrew a thick, securely sealed legal folder. The heavy manila envelope was filled with hundreds of pages of meticulously assembled evidence, binding financial documentation, and comprehensive forensic data. I held it briefly in both hands, feeling the undeniable density of the power contained within. This was not merely a collection of documents. It was the total and permanent end of the world they had constructed. It was the instrument that would strip away every fabrication they had ever sustained. With a slow and deliberate motion, I raised the folder and brought it down firmly onto the center of the pristine dining table. The impact produced a heavy, resonant thud that sliced through the remaining tension in the room like a single, clean gunshot. Crystal water glasses trembled from the force. Patricia jolted backward in her seat. Audrey flinched visibly, her mocking smile evaporating in an instant. Brandon stared at the thick envelope, watching his triumphant smirk dissolve slowly into a mask of profound and dawning apprehension. The stage was perfectly set, the audience was fully assembled, and I was absolutely ready to reduce their illusions to ash. I broke the seal on the heavy manila folder with a single decisive tear. The sharp sound carried clearly across the silent dining room. I reached inside and withdrew a substantial stack of crisp legal documents, the bright white paper contrasting starkly against the dark mahogany of the country club table. I selected the topmost document, a heavy packet fastened with a brass clip and bearing a raised official state seal, and placed my fingertips at its edge. With a smooth, unhurried motion, I slid it across the polished surface directly toward Patricia, where it came to rest beside her empty wine glass. Patricia stared down at the paper as though it might be venomous. She did not immediately reach for it. Her eyes moved between the document and my face, scanning intensely for any sign of hesitation, exaggeration, or bluff. When she found absolutely none, her bravado faltered for one unmistakable fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, crossing her arms defensively over her chest with practiced defiance. "What is this garbage?" Patricia demanded, her tone saturated with artificial disdain. "Do you honestly expect me to sit here reading your little printouts? I just finished telling you that my son is going to remove you from his home, and you respond by sliding me paperwork? You are completely delusional, Olivia." I did not break eye contact with her for even a moment. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, resting my hands in my lap with complete ease. "I strongly suggest you read the first page, Patricia," I said, my tone perfectly even and entirely devoid of emotional charge. "You were just screaming at the top of your lungs about how Brandon is going to remove me from his luxury downtown penthouse, about how I would be packing my belongings and sleeping on the sidewalk. That document directly in front of you is the official, notarized property deed to that exact residence." Brandon shifted in his seat with visible discomfort. He leaned over his mother's shoulder, eyes narrowing as he attempted to decipher the bold print at the top of the page from an upside-down angle. His brow deepened into a tight, confused furrow. I kept my gaze anchored on Patricia and allowed my voice to carry just far enough for the neighboring tables to absorb every word of what was coming. "That penthouse does not belong to your son," I stated with calm, surgical clarity. "It never has. That sprawling multi-million-dollar residence with the panoramic views of the city skyline is owned in its entirety by a corporate holding company. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of that holding company. I hold 100% of the equity." The color left Brandon's face in a single visible wave. He snatched the document from the table before his mother's hand could reach it. His eyes moved rapidly across the legal language, scanning the highlighted sections, the notarized signatures, and the official county clerk stamps with increasing desperation. His hands began to tremble perceptibly. As a wealth manager, he understood precisely what he was looking at. He recognized the absolute legal authority of a corporate property deed. "That is completely impossible," Brandon stammered, his voice fracturing with sudden, overwhelming panic. He looked up at me, his arrogant facade disintegrating in real time into something raw and frightened. "I pay the utility bills. I manage the building association accounts for that property. I handle every expense." "You pay the utility bills because you are legally classified as a month-to-month tenant," I corrected him, my voice cutting through his fragile defense with precision. "I arranged the structure that way deliberately, so that you could maintain the feeling of being the provider of the household. You manage minor monthly expenses to satisfy your ego, but you do not own a single square inch of that property. You hold zero equity. If anyone will be removed from that residence tomorrow morning, Brandon, it will be you. My legal team already has the eviction notice drafted and prepared to be served." Patricia slammed her palm on the table, refusing with every fiber of her being to accept the reality materializing before her. "This is a complete forgery!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with panicked denial. She reached across and tore the document from Brandon's shaking hands. "You generated this online. You are a computer repair girl. There is absolutely no conceivable way a nobody like you could own a penthouse in the most exclusive address in this city. My son is a highly successful wealth manager. He is the provider. He secured that real estate." She swept frantic eyes around the dining room, desperately appealing to the wealthy onlookers who were now openly watching our table without any pretense of discretion. "She is lying," Patricia announced to the surrounding patrons, her voice teetering on hysteria. "She is a calculating, manipulative liar attempting to steal my son's rightful assets." I let her finish every last word of her frantic, humiliating display before I delivered the final piece. "I purchased that penthouse in an all-cash transaction 3 years before I ever met your son," I explained, laying out the legal architecture with methodical precision and leaving absolutely no gaps for her delusions to occupy. "I established a Delaware-based limited liability company specifically designed to acquire high-value real estate assets with full anonymity. I used a blind trust mechanism to completely shield my identity from public property records, which is precisely why Brandon never encountered my name when he conducted his superficial background checks. When we moved in together, my corporate attorneys drafted a standard residential lease agreement. Brandon signed it without reading a single line, assuming it was routine building association paperwork, because he was far too arrogant to actually read documents that his computer girl wife placed in front of him. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table and holding Patricia's gaze directly. "Because the asset was acquired prior to our marriage and is held entirely within a separate corporate structure that I independently fund and control, it is completely insulated from any marital claim. Even in a community property jurisdiction, Brandon has zero legal standing to assert ownership over a single dollar of its value. Your son is a tenant, Patricia. He has been living in my home, sleeping in my bed, and performing the role of a prosperous provider on my financial resources. Brandon dropped his head into his hands. The full weight of the realization struck him with the force of something catastrophic and irreversible. He was a wealth manager who did not own his own home. He was a man who had built his entire identity around status and financial authority, and he had been entirely financially dependent on the wife he had just publicly humiliated in front of his professional network. Patricia stared at the deed in her trembling hands, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The official stamps, the corporate seals, the irrefutable notarized proof of my sole ownership were all right there in black and white. She could not charm her way out of a state document. The most devastating threat she had wielded to force my submission had just been smoothly redirected and pressed squarely against her own son's chest. This was merely the first domino. I watched the profound shock move through their faces like a tide, feeling a quiet, steady sense of earned justice settling into my bones. They had cornered me with everything they thought they had, expecting me to collapse under the weight of losing their prestigious lifestyle. They had no earthly idea that I was the one who owned the corner, the building, the furniture within it, and the very ground their expensive shoes were resting on. I reached back into the heavy manila folder, my fingers moving past the remaining property records until they found the next thick stack of financial documentation. The penthouse had been the opening move. I was entirely prepared to dismantle the remainder of their fraudulent empire, piece by deliberate piece. I slid my hand deeper into the folder, bypassing the remaining property documents until my fingers found the dense stack of financial statements waiting beneath them. Patricia was staring blankly at the penthouse deed in her hands, her chest rising and falling unevenly as she struggled to absorb what had just happened. Her eyes darted frantically around the dining room, sweeping across the faces of her wealthy friends at neighboring tables, who were watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from scandalized delight to barely concealed hunger. In the fiercely competitive ecosystem of the Oakwood Country Club, the exposure of manufactured wealth was a spectator event of the highest order. The sharks had detected blood in the water, and they had gathered. "Keep your voice down," Patricia hissed, abandoning her theatrical projection entirely and dropping to a venomous, urgent whisper. Her manicured nails dug visibly into the pristine white tablecloth. "You have made your point about the real estate, Olivia. Now put those papers away before you trigger a permanent public scandal. You are causing irreparable damage to our standing in front of the board members. We can discuss all of this rationally at home, like civilized adults." I did not lower my voice. I ensured my articulation was crisp, my projection deliberate, carrying every word precisely far enough to reach every listening ear in the surrounding silence. "We are not going home, Patricia," I stated clearly. "And I would argue that civility has not been on the table this evening. You forfeited your right to a private conversation the moment you attempted to physically assault me in public. You designed this moment to have witnesses watch my submission. They are going to witness something rather different instead." I retrieved a stapled packet of documents from the folder and placed it at the center of the table with a quiet and authoritative thud. The cover page bore the unmistakable, bold official seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court. Brandon recognized the document layout immediately and reached for it instinctively. Gideon shifted his weight by a single fraction of an inch. Brandon's hand stopped as though it had encountered an invisible wall. "Patricia," I continued, holding her horrified gaze without mercy, "for the past 4 years you have commanded the attention and respect of this country club by performing the role of an untouchable old money matriarch. You have treated the staff here as though they were beneath your notice. You have looked down with open contempt on every person in this room who works for a living. You have reminded anyone within earshot that your family's wealth is ancient, distinguished, and completely beyond scrutiny. It is an impressive performance. Genuinely. I pressed a single fingernail to the cover of the bankruptcy filing. But the performance concludes tonight. 4 years ago, your late husband's manufacturing business did not experience a mild market correction, as you described to your social circle. It collapsed entirely. You liquidated your summer home, you sold your antique jewelry collection piece by piece, and then you filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. Your celebrated old money fortune was completely erased 48 months ago. You have been financially insolvent since before I ever set foot in this club. The reaction from the surrounding tables was immediate and audible. An older woman in a diamond tennis bracelet 2 tables over covered her mouth with an audible intake of breath. A prominent local politician who had been pretending not to listen leaned forward with undisguised fascination. In the ruthlessly status-conscious world of the Oakwood Country Club, the exposure of fabricated wealth while publicly degrading others was not merely embarrassing. It was an act of social self-immolation. Patricia's face turned an ashen, sickening gray. She shrank back into her chair as though the wood itself were trying to absorb her, her aggressive posture completely evacuated. "That is a lie," she managed, her voice shaking so badly the words were barely coherent. "We restructured our assets. We executed a strategic financial realignment. You are fabricating these documents to destroy my reputation." "I am doing nothing of the sort," I countered, my tone remaining fluid and unhurried. "I operate a digital forensics firm. Recovering buried and obfuscated financial data is precisely what corporations and government agencies pay me considerable sums of money to accomplish. Locating your bankruptcy filings took my junior analyst exactly 12 minutes from the moment I assigned the task. You carry zero liquidity and zero tangible assets. The only thing attached to your name is an extraordinary and carefully concealed mountain of debt." Brandon buried his face completely in his hands, unable to meet the eyes of a single person in the room. He had spent years cultivating the image of a sophisticated top-tier wealth manager overseeing his family's substantial portfolio. His peers were now watching that carefully assembled fiction dissolve in real time. "But if you are entirely without funds," I continued, allowing my voice to carry just far enough, "then precisely how does this lifestyle sustain itself? How are the exorbitant monthly membership dues to this exclusive club being paid? How does Audrey drive a brand new Porsche Cayenne to her charity luncheons? How is anyone covering the considerable bill accumulating right now for the vintage wine and prime steaks this table ordered for this anniversary dinner?" Patricia stared at me with the wide, hollow eyes of someone watching the exit doors disappear. She knew the answer. She had always known it. She had simply worked very hard never to examine it directly, allowing herself the comfortable protection of willful ignorance. She had told herself that Brandon was somehow generating the funds, conveniently overlooking the mathematical impossibility of his actual salary supporting this level of expenditure. I reached into my designer handbag one final time. I withdrew a sleek, heavy matte black corporate card and set it down with quiet deliberateness on top of the bankruptcy filing. The card absorbed the light of the chandeliers rather than reflecting it back, heavy, understated, and unmistakably significant. "Every luxury you have experienced and performed for the past 3 years has been entirely funded by me," I announced, delivering the final and most precise blow to the architecture of her fabricated identity. "The Oakwood Country Club membership dues are automatically charged to my corporate account on the 1st of every month. The lease payments for Audrey's Porsche Cayenne are drawn from my secondary business account. The designer clothing you wear to these events, the elaborate dinners you host to perform your wealth for this room, the vintage Cabernet currently sitting in your glass, every single dollar of it flows directly from the bank accounts of the computer repair girl you have chosen to despise." I allowed the absolute truth to hang in the air above the table for a long, unhurried moment, watching it settle with the weight of something irreversible. You are not a wealthy matriarch, Patricia. You are a dependent. You have been living entirely on my generosity while treating me as though I were beneath your contempt. And effective as of 10 minutes ago, I have permanently canceled every card you hold access to, revoked every membership, and terminated every financial arrangement attached to your name or your household. The dining room had gone completely, utterly silent. Patricia sat motionless, tears of deep and unrecoverable humiliation rising in her eyes. The social reputation she had spent decades carefully constructing and obsessively maintained had just been permanently, publicly, and irrevocably destroyed, in the one room in the world where it mattered most to her. Audrey, sitting in stunned silence, suddenly slammed both hands onto the table, her face flushed with blind animal panic, as the full realization dawned on her that the comfortable free ride she had been coasting on for years had come to a permanent and irreversible end. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was absolute, uncontained chaos. Patricia sat completely immobilized by the sheer magnitude of her public exposure. Every trace of color had evacuated her face, leaving her a pale, trembling shell of the arrogant, imperious woman who had demanded my jewelry just minutes earlier. The carefully constructed illusion of her old money prestige, the elaborate social performance she had used for years to terrorize and diminish me, had been erased so completely that not even the faintest outline of it remained. The surrounding tables, initially stunned into breathless silence by the escalating confrontation, were now alive with electrified, rushing whispers. The scandal was spreading through the Oakwood Country Club with the speed and appetite of wildfire, and there was absolutely no mechanism in existence capable of containing it now. Audrey, however, reacted with the frantic, flailing desperation of a cornered animal who had just watched the cage door slam shut. She understood with visceral clarity that the financial lifeline she had grown entirely dependent upon had been severed, and that the perfectly subsidized life she had mistaken for her birthright was evaporating before her eyes in real time. Her panic did not manifest as stillness or silence. It erupted as pure, unfiltered, incandescent rage. She drove both hands down onto the table with a force that rattled the crystal, her face flushed with a volatile mixture of genuine terror and barely contained fury. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, purchased without her knowledge on my corporate account, clattered loudly against the mahogany. "You are a pathological liar, Olivia!" Audrey shrieked, her voice fracturing with the desperate energy of someone trying to drown out an inconvenient truth with sufficient volume. Her eyes darted wildly around the room in frantic search of any available form of validation. "Do not listen to a single word she says," she announced to the openly staring patrons at the surrounding tables. "She is a manipulative, jealous nobody who is attempting to dismantle our family because she could never truly be one of us. Every document in that envelope is a fabrication. She printed them from her computer to manufacture a crisis, because she is a bitter, pathetic woman who cannot stand watching other people thrive." Audrey's attempt to gaslight an entire room full of sophisticated, high-functioning adults was breathtaking in its arrogance, and equally breathtaking in its futility. The thick, officially notarized documents resting visibly on the table provided undeniable proof, and the meticulous precision of my exposure left absolutely no room for any alternative interpretation. The elite membership of the Oakwood Country Club had not accumulated their positions of influence by being easy to deceive. They could recognize the irreparable stench of a shattered illusion from a considerable distance. Realizing that her screaming was achieving nothing except making her appear increasingly unhinged, Audrey abruptly shifted tactics. She turned sharply to her right and seized the arm of her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon, a tall, imposing man whose calm, commanding presence inspired immediate and instinctive respect in any environment he entered. Unlike every other member of Brandon's family who occupied that table, Jamal had genuinely, methodically, and painstakingly earned everything attached to his name. He worked punishing hours at the hospital, performing intricate, high-stakes surgeries, and constructing an impeccable professional reputation through nothing but raw talent and relentless, unwavering dedication. I had always held a deep and sincere respect for him, and it caused me a real and genuine pang of regret that he had become entangled in the toxic, festering web his wife's family had spent years weaving around itself. Audrey dug her manicured nails into Jamal's forearm, using him simultaneously as a physical shield and a social endorsement. "Jamal, do something," she demanded, her voice climbing to a shrill and desperate register. "Call the hospital's legal team right now. I want her prosecuted for defamation. I want her physically removed from this club and arrested for forging federal financial documents. Tell everyone here who you are. Tell them that we have never needed a single dime from this computer repair girl." Jamal looked genuinely bewildered in a way that was almost painful to observe. He had been sitting in stunned, absorptive silence since the confrontation ignited, completely unaware of the deep and pervasive financial rot that had been quietly consuming the foundations of his wife's family from the inside. He had believed the same carefully maintained lies they sold to everyone else, that Patricia commanded genuine generational wealth, that Brandon was a highly accomplished and prosperous wealth manager handling elite portfolios, that Audrey's lavish spending was simply the natural expression of a family accustomed to abundance, supplemented by his own substantial surgical income. He had absolutely no conception that the lifestyle he admired and participated in had been funded entirely by the woman sitting across the table from him. Jamal gently but unmistakably detached Audrey's fingers from his forearm. He looked at her flushed, frantic, rapidly deteriorating expression, then shifted his gaze to the thick stack of legal documents resting at the center of the table. The confusion in his eyes was profound and undeniable. He was a man of rigorous science, uncompromising logic, and absolute empirical precision, and the arithmetic of his life had suddenly, catastrophically, stopped making any sense. "Audrey, please lower your voice," Jamal said, his tone deep, measured, and carefully controlled in its attempt to pull the situation back from the precipice. "You are creating an unnecessary scene. Let us take a breath and establish what is actually happening here." "Do not tell me to lower my voice," Audrey snapped back, her panic overriding every remaining shred of social decorum. "She is attacking our family. She is trying to publicly humiliate my mother and destroy everything we have built. You need to defend me right now, Jamal. Call your attorneys immediately and dismantle everything she has put on that table." Jamal looked at me. He did not see a vindictive, jealous woman manufacturing a crisis out of personal bitterness. He saw a person who had just systematically and methodically dismantled a massive, sophisticated deception using irrefutable, layered, forensically verified evidence. He looked back at Audrey, and I watched his expression transition from confusion to something considerably more unsettling, a deep, quiet, spreading concern. He was beginning to understand that the hysterical woman clinging to his arm was not fighting against a lie. She was fighting against the truth. "Olivia," Jamal said carefully, addressing me directly for the first time since the confrontation had erupted into its full, spectacular chaos. "What exactly is the full extent of what you are describing here? Are you genuinely telling me that you have been personally funding Patricia's and Brandon's lifestyle?" I nodded slowly, keeping my tone warm, measured, and filled with genuine and unperformed respect for the man across from me. "I am genuinely sorry that you were brought into the middle of this, Jamal. Truly. But yes, Every document on this table is completely and verifiably authentic. Patricia filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection 4 years ago. Brandon does not hold any equity in the penthouse, and his actual income is nowhere close to sufficient to support the image he projects in rooms like this one. Every luxury this family has presented to the world since I married Brandon has been quietly financed by my company. Audrey released a sound of pure, strangled frustration and drove her palm against the table again. Stop listening to her, Jamal. She is lying to your face. She is attempting to turn you against your own wife. Why would you extend even 1 ounce of credibility to anything she says over the word of the woman you married and built a life with? Because she brought documentation, Jamal replied softly. The 2 words carried the quiet, devastating weight of a verdict. His eyes remained fixed on the bankruptcy filing bearing the raised seal of the federal court. He reached out tentatively, his large hand hovering just above the stack of papers. Audrey lunged forward with desperate speed, attempting to intercept the documents before Jamal's fingers could make contact. "Do not look at any of that," she shrieked, her composure finally and completely fracturing. "It is fabricated. I promise you, Jamal. Every single page of it is a complete fabrication. Please trust me." Before Audrey's fingers could graze the edge of the papers, Gideon moved. He did not step fully from the shadows, but his hand shot forward with a speed that was difficult to track, cleanly intercepting Audrey's outstretched wrist in midair. He did not apply the nerve pressure he had used to subdue Patricia. He simply brought her forward momentum to a complete and immediate stop with a grip that suggested immovability rather than aggression. "Do not touch the documents, ma'am," Gideon said, his voice a low, resonant warning that seemed to vibrate through the table itself. Audrey recoiled as though she had received an electric shock, yanking her arm back with wide, startled eyes. Jamal's protective instincts shifted visibly in his posture, but he did not escalate toward a physical confrontation. He recognized with the practiced clarity of a man trained to assess situations rapidly that Gideon was acting in a purely and precisely defensive capacity. The tension at the table had become a physical, atmospheric presence, something the entire dining room was holding itself against. I redirected my attention away from Audrey's unraveling performance and focused it with deliberate intention on Jamal. When I looked at him, I consciously softened my posture and let the cold, razor-edged composure I had maintained through the confrontation with Patricia and Brandon dissolve into something warmer and more human. Jamal had not earned a single ounce of my hostility. He was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon who spent his professional life repairing shattered bones and restoring mobility to bodies that had lost it. He worked 80-hour weeks standing in operating rooms under intense and unforgiving pressure, carrying the literal and figurative weight of human lives in his extraordinary hands. He had built his wealth, his reputation, and his standing through relentless discipline and undeniable, documented talent. He was the only other person at this table who understood, in the most fundamental and bone-deep way, what it actually meant to earn every single dollar that bore your name. "Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and genuinely respectful. "I am profoundly sorry that you were dragged into the center of this tonight. You are a good man and a genuinely decent human being. You are a hard-working professional of real integrity, and you have always treated me with kindness and basic human dignity from the very first moment we met. You are the only member of this entire family who ever once looked at me as an equal, rather than as something inconvenient to be managed or scraped from the bottom of a very expensive shoe. It pains me sincerely and deeply that your integrity has become entangled in this web of compounded, calculated deception. But you deserve to know the complete truth about your own life, with exactly the same urgency and conviction with which I deserve to know the truth about mine." Jamal kept his dark, steady eyes locked on mine. He did not speak, but the rigid, braced set of his broad shoulders communicated that he was preparing himself to absorb a significant impact. He was a physician who understood the precise emotional architecture of delivering devastating news, and he recognized with clinical accuracy the particular tone of voice that belongs to someone who is about to permanently and irrevocably alter another person's reality. I reached into my designer handbag for the final time. My fingers moved past the remaining property records and corporate tax returns with certainty and purpose, locating a separate, considerably smaller manila envelope waiting beneath them. It was sealed with red tamper-evident security tape. I withdrew it carefully and placed it on the table in front of me, my hand resting lightly on top of it. "This does not involve Brandon or Patricia," I explained, holding Jamal's gaze. "This concerns your marriage specifically, the management of your clinic earnings, and the financial future that was being constructed, or rather, dismantled, for your children." My company conducted a deep forensic diagnostic examination of the financial networks and account structures connected to this family. What we uncovered within your personal accounts was profoundly and genuinely disturbing. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the sealed envelope and slid it with slow, deliberate precision across the polished mahogany surface directly toward Jamal. Audrey emitted a visceral, animal gasp of terror. Her eyes went wide with the particular, unmistakable fear of someone who knows exactly what is contained within a sealed room and understands they are about to be locked inside it. The performance of righteous indignation she had been sustaining collapsed instantaneously, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a person whose carefully concealed crimes are about to be read aloud to the person they wronged most. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking into something jagged and hysterical. "Do not open that, Jamal, please. It is lies. It is all fabricated lies. She is trying to poison the one thing in this family that is real and good. Please do not look at it." Audrey threw herself forward across the table with wild, uncoordinated urgency, her upper body lunging toward the envelope, manicured hands clawing desperately at the polished wood in a frantic bid to snatch the package before it could reach her husband's hands. She was not fast enough. Gideon stepped forward with absolute breathtaking precision. He did not strike her or deploy excessive force. He inserted his massive forearm into her path with the quiet efficiency of an immovable structural barrier, creating an impenetrable physical blockade between Audrey and the envelope. He deflected her reaching, grasping hands with the effortless ease of someone redirecting a gentle disturbance rather than managing a genuine physical threat. Audrey collided with the wall of his arm and bounced back into her chair, breathless and completely powerless to stop what was coming. Jamal reached forward and picked up the envelope. He did not look at his wife, who had begun weeping hysterically beside him and begging him in a low, urgent, desperate voice to dispose of the packet unopened. His eyes remained fixed on the red security seal. His hands, the extraordinary, precise, legendarily steady hands of a master surgeon, hesitated for a single, fractional second before he broke the seal with a clean, decisive motion and withdrew the crisp, high-resolution financial forensic reports from within. The entire dining room seemed to collectively suspend its breath. I sat back and observed his facial expressions with quiet, careful attention, watching the clinical, methodical process by which a brilliant analytical mind begins to decode information it was never intended to encounter. At first, his brow creased in deep, focused confusion. He was examining data sets, routing numbers, and offshore wire transfer logs that made no immediate sense within the context of his understanding of his own financial life. I had prepared the reports with clear, highlighted summaries, stripping away the complex technical coding and leaving only the undeniable, legible trails of money and intent. I watched his dark eyes move across the first page with increasing focus. He recognized his own primary banking accounts, the accounts into which his substantial surgical income arrived, with reliable, bi-weekly precision. He recognized the routing numbers for the joint savings accounts he and Audrey shared, the funds they had explicitly and deliberately earmarked together for their children's college education and their long-term investment future. Then I saw the exact, precise moment when the confusion shifted into something far darker and more devastating. His eyes found the highlighted withdrawal columns. He observed the systematic, methodically organized funneling of substantial sums of money flowing out of his secured accounts in a pattern too consistent and too structured to be accidental. His lips parted by a fraction. A breath caught somewhere in his chest. Jamal turned to the second page, which documented the destination of those extracted funds in granular detail. His sharp, methodically trained mind connected the pattern with a speed that was almost painful to observe. The money was not flowing into an investment portfolio. It was not accumulating in a trust vehicle for his children's futures. It was being wired directly and repeatedly into private, unlisted accounts, controlled entirely by his brother-in-law, Brandon. The transformation of Jamal's face was devastating to witness. The composed, authoritative surgeon dissolved, and in his place sat a man whose fundamental architecture of trust had been systematically and comprehensively obliterated. His jaw set. The warmth evacuated from his dark brown eyes entirely, leaving behind something cold, hard, and unforgiving. He sat perfectly still in a state of complete disbelief, his world collapsing around him in a silence so complete it was somehow louder than Audrey's screaming. His large hands tightened on the edges of the forensic printout with sufficient force that his knuckles lost their color entirely. I watched the heavy, irreversible realization settle through him as his brilliant mind aligned the devastating columns of figures with the everyday fabric of lies his wife had woven around their life together. He was staring at irrefutable, forensically verified evidence of financial infidelity on a scale that defied easy comprehension. The meticulously highlighted rows on the paper were not simply missing dollars. They represented thousands of hours he had spent standing in sterile operating rooms under punishing fluorescent light, missing dinners with his children, missing birthdays and recitals and ordinary evenings at home, all in service of a future that had been secretly, systematically looted. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice low and measured, guiding him through the dense digital forensics with the care appropriate to the moment. I understand that the routing codes can be difficult to translate at an initial glance, I said softly, ensuring the private details of his destroyed marriage were not broadcast to the surrounding tables. But look at the summary on the second page. Those are the specific accounts Audrey represented to you as being actively managed for your children. The college trust funds that you have been funding aggressively and consistently for the past 3 years. Jamal turned the page with measured deliberateness. The paper trembled faintly in his hands, the first visible break in the physical steadiness that defined him. The color evacuated his face entirely as his eyes found the final balance of the accounts that were supposed to represent the secured educational futures of his children. The accounts were effectively empty. There was no robust investment portfolio compounding quietly in the background. There was no accumulating interest building toward the futures he had imagined. There was only a hollow, drained shell of an account that had been systematically bled dry, month after patient month, by the precise person he had entrusted with its stewardship. Audrey did not deposit your surgical earnings into those trust accounts, I stated, laying the ugly and unvarnished truth before him with careful and deliberate precision. Every time you handed over a portion of your income to build a financial safety net for your children's futures, she intercepted the capital before it reached its intended destination. The digital trace my team assembled is comprehensive and without gaps. She held direct authorized access to your primary deposit accounts. She diverted the assets at the source, before they ever arrived where you believed they were going. Jamal raised his head slowly. His gaze traveled from the documents to his wife. Audrey was shaking with a visible, uncontrolled trembling, her face drained of all color and covered in a thin sheen of cold sweat. She could not hold his gaze. She stared at the expensive mahogany of the table in front of her, her breathing shallow and entirely irregular. "Where did it go?" Jamal asked. His voice was a low, controlled, dangerous rumble that pulled the immediate attention of every person at the table with the gravitational force of something unavoidable. It did not carry the texture of a genuine question. It carried the specific quality of a final and absolute warning issued by a man who had just identified a predator operating within his own home. I directed his attention to the third page of the forensic packet. The funneling scheme was remarkably aggressive in its frequency, I explained, but forensically it was extraordinarily careless. Audrey executed continuous systematic wire transfers from your joint checking accounts directly into Brandon's private, unlisted accounts. If you examine the compiled transaction ledger on the following page, the total sum extracted over the preceding 36 months exceeds $400,000. The number occupied the air above the table like a physical presence. $400,000. Nearly $500,000 of Jamal's relentless accumulated surgical labor, secretly and methodically siphoned away by his own wife and channeled into his brother-in-law's accounts. "Why?" Jamal demanded. The word cracked under the combined weight of profound grief and rapidly building fury. He turned his gaze to Brandon, who was currently studying the floor with the desperate focus of a man hoping to become invisible through sheer concentration. "Why would you take my money? Why would she give it to you?" "Because Brandon is not what he has presented himself as, Jamal," I answered for her, ensuring that every person at the table absorbed the full depth of the betrayal being revealed. Brandon is not a successful wealth manager with a prestigious roster of elite clients. His entire professional identity is a fabricated performance designed to sustain this family's fraudulent old money appearance. Audrey systematically stole your surgical earnings and funneled them to her brother so that he could lease expensive vehicles, maintain a lifestyle of conspicuous consumption, and perform the role of a high-rolling executive for an audience of people whose respect he has never genuinely earned. You have been unknowingly and continuously funding Brandon's entire elaborate fiction so that Patricia and Audrey could continue arriving at this country club, projecting the illusion of royalty. The full and complete reality of the deception shattered the last surviving fragment of Audrey's composure with surgical finality. She erupted into heaving, hysterical sobbing, tears streaming in dark rivulets of ruined makeup down her face. She threw herself toward Jamal, completely disregarding Gideon's unmistakable presence, and seized her husband's suit jacket in both hands with the desperate, white-knuckled grip of someone clinging to the last available handhold above a very long drop. "Jamal, please," Audrey wept, her voice shredding at the edges with desperation. "You have to listen to me. You have to let me explain, please." Jamal did not pull away. But he offered her absolutely nothing in return. No warmth, no reassurance, no reflexive softening of his expression in response to her tears. He simply observed her with the hollow, devastated eyes of a man recalibrating the entire accumulated understanding of his own recent history. "She is jealous of everything we have built together," Audrey continued through her sobs, her gaslighting escalating to a frantic and increasingly incoherent register. "She knows that her own husband doesn't truly love her, so she is attempting to poison our marriage out of pure, corrosive envy. She wants to dismantle our life because we have what she could never achieve on her own. Look at her, Jamal. She is a manipulative, calculated predator who is trying to separate us using forged financial documents. You know me. You have known me for a decade. You know I would never steal from our own children. I need you to look at me right now and tell her she is a liar." Audrey buried her face in Jamal's chest, crying with a volume and abandon that finally prompted the restaurant manager to begin making his way toward our table through the crowded, riveted dining room. She clung to her husband with the full, desperate weight of a person who understood at some fundamental level that she was losing him, that the loss was entirely self-inflicted, and that there was no available argument, no available tear, no available appeal to love or history or shared parenthood that was going to override the arithmetic of $400,000 and 36 months of documented theft. Jamal's brilliant mind was already beyond the reach of her performance. The hard, irrefutable evidence sitting in his hands was already burned permanently into his consciousness, and no quantity of theatrical grief was going to erase or reframe the transaction records, the routing logs, or the forensic audit trail my team had assembled with such methodical care. I did not allow Audrey's spiraling, desperate performance to derail the momentum of the truth I had come here to deliver. I simply redirected my gaze from the hysterical woman clinging to her husband and settled it with quiet, purposeful clarity on Brandon. He was still staring at the floor with the studied intensity of a man hoping that the universe might spare him if he made himself small enough and still enough for long enough. "Brandon," I said, my voice projecting clearly and precisely over the sound of his sister's unraveling. "Minutes ago, you sat at this table and issued demands regarding my mother's necklace. You lectured me at considerable length about my duty to support this family. You cited Audrey and Jamal's financial difficulties as justification for appropriating my most personal and irreplaceable possession. What you deliberately neglected to include in that lecture was the rather significant detail that you were personally responsible for manufacturing those very financial difficulties." Jamal slowly and deliberately removed Audrey's clutching fingers from his suit jacket one by one. He set her hands back in her own lap without looking at her, then shifted his full, undivided attention to Brandon. The orthopedic surgeon was assembling the complete picture now, with the merciless efficiency of a mind built for precision diagnosis. "What did you do with my money, Brandon?" Jamal asked. His voice had transitioned entirely out of the deep, commanding register that typically filled rooms with its presence. It had become something quieter and considerably more terrifying. An icy, controlled whisper that carried the specific weight of a man who has decided, with complete and final certainty, what is going to happen next. I answered for my cowardly husband, who appeared physiologically incapable of making eye contact with the man he had robbed. "He did not invest your surgical earnings in a safe, high-yield savings vehicle, Jamal," I said, directing his attention to the 4th page of the forensic packet with a tap of my finger. "He did not acquire real estate. He did not build a portfolio. Brandon took your $400,000 and poured every last dollar of it into the stock market, not through any legitimate investment strategy, but through the kind of reckless, leveraged speculation that belongs in a high-stakes casino rather than a responsible financial management practice." I placed the relevant page where Jamal could examine it clearly. Brandon wanted to validate his identity as a financial genius in front of his mother and in front of the members of this club. Rather than building a legitimate professional track record through actual client results, he took your stolen capital and treated volatile options markets as his personal vehicle for manufactured glory. He bought highly leveraged contracts on margin, placing massive concentrated bets on unstable technology stocks and failing cryptocurrency ventures. His underlying theory was that he could double your $400,000 within a short window, retain the profits as personal compensation for his brilliance, and return the principal before the absence was ever detected. I paused for a moment to allow the room to absorb that before I delivered the rest. Brandon is not a financial genius. He is an incompetent, overconfident amateur who fundamentally misunderstands how capital markets actually function. The performance record on the page in front of you is comprehensive and unambiguous. In 36 months of active trading, Brandon systematically and spectacularly destroyed 90% of the capital Audrey transferred to him. Of the $400,000 you earned in operating rooms, Jamal, less than $40,000 remains. The rest has been permanently and irrecoverably vaporized by a man who plays pretend with other people's money while lecturing his wife about her actual, genuinely successful business enterprise. Brandon finally raised his eyes from the floor. His face was a wretched portrait of shame, panic, and the specific misery of a man watching his most carefully constructed illusions detonate simultaneously in front of witnesses he has spent years trying to impress. He opened his mouth. The words that came out were predictable in their bankruptcy. The market conditions were genuinely unprecedented during that period. He stammered, his voice cracking in multiple places within a single sentence. There were significant macroeconomic factors entirely outside my ability to control or anticipate. The strategy I was executing was a sophisticated multi-tiered hedging approach that simply required additional time and capital to reach maturity and deliver returns. Close your mouth. Jamal's two words arrived with the clean, devastating finality of a surgical incision. Brandon's mouth snapped shut with an almost audible click. He swallowed with visible effort, pressing himself backward in his heavy chair as though trying to physically insert distance between himself and the towering, utterly furious man across the table. Jamal stared at the forensic reports, but his eyes had moved beyond the numbers on the page. He was looking backward through the preceding 3 years of his life, replaying with new and brutal clarity every argument that had seemed unresolved, every explanation that had failed to fully satisfy, every moment of inexplicable tension around household finances that Audrey had managed to redirect or reframe before he could examine it too closely. The crushing, suffocating weight of the betrayal finally broke through the initial shock that had been holding it at bay, settling into his bones with the permanence of something that cannot be unfelt. "It makes complete sense now," Jamal said. His voice had been stripped of everything that normally inhabited it: its warmth, its authority, its professional command. What remained was hollow and precise, like an empty room. He turned his head slowly to look at Audrey, who was now weeping into her cupped hands, physically incapable of meeting his gaze. "This is why you insisted on managing our household finances entirely from the very beginning of our marriage. You told me that my schedule at the hospital was too demanding to justify adding financial administration to my cognitive load. You told me you wanted to assume that responsibility so I could direct my full attention toward my patients." Audrey shook her head with rapid, frantic denial, as though the physical motion could retroactively erase the memories he was articulating. Jamal did not register the denial. His mind was moving through the evidence methodically and without mercy. "This is why the login credentials for our joint savings accounts were never accessible to me when I asked for them. You told me you couldn't recall the passwords. You told me the bank's website was experiencing scheduled maintenance. Every single time I initiated a conversation about our children's college funds, you redirected it into a prolonged argument about trust and respect. You used my genuine love for you and my baseline guilt about the hours I spend away from our family to keep me deliberately and systematically blind to what you were actually doing with our money." He looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. He looked at the designer handbag on the floor beside her chair. He looked at Patricia, frozen and ashen across the table, and then at Brandon, the man who had taken his money and incinerated it through spectacular incompetence and bottomless arrogance. The complete picture assembled itself in his mind with the terrible, clean clarity of a perfect diagnosis. "You isolated my income," Jamal stated, his voice dropping into a register of pure, cold disgust that was somehow more devastating than rage would have been. "You intercepted the earnings I bled for and transferred them to your incompetent brother so that this entire fraudulent family could sustain the performance of wealth they never actually possessed. You stole from our children, Audrey." You robbed your own children of their educational futures, the futures I sacrificed years of my life building, so that you could drive a luxury vehicle and occupy a VIP seat in a country club that you have absolutely no legitimate claim to. The depth of the betrayal landed on him in layers, each one heavier than the last. It was not simply about the $400,000, devastating as that figure was. It was about the texture of daily deception, waking up every single morning beside a woman who kissed him, smiled at his face, sent him to the hospital with genuine affection in her eyes, and then immediately, systematically, set about plundering the future he was sacrificing himself to construct for the people he loved most. He had been her most reliable resource. He had been her most productive asset. And she had treated his trust and his love as the most exploitable features of his character. Jamal understood now, with a clarity he would carry for the rest of his life, that his marriage had not been a partnership. It had been an extraction operation. The woman he had loved had treated him not as a husband, not as a father and co-architect of a shared future, but as a highly compensated and conveniently trusting mark. Audrey saw the exact specific moment when the light of love and trust permanently extinguished in her husband's eyes. The precise instant she recognized it, absolute and consuming panic took complete possession of her. She launched into a torrent of desperate speech, words colliding and overlapping in their urgency, grabbing the fabric of his expensive suit with shaking hands. She insisted she had only been trying to support her brother through what she had believed was a temporary and manageable financial difficulty. She swore with absolute conviction that she had intended to replace every dollar before Jamal ever became aware of the discrepancy. She reached for their children as a final available shield, sobbing about the devastating impact a sudden and public divorce would inflict on their family structure, about how profoundly their children needed the stability of an intact home, about how Jamal's paternal love and instincts were too important and too generous to be weaponized against her in this moment. Jamal did not withdraw from her physical grasp. But he did not move toward her either. He sat completely still and allowed her to speak, watching her performance with the cold, clinical detachment of a physician who has already arrived at a diagnosis and is simply observing the progression of symptoms. He listened to her deploy the names and the futures of their children as tactical instruments, and he understood now, with a certainty that required no further evidence, that a person who had spent 3 years robbing her children's educational future had forfeited any authentic claim to be acting in their interests. When she finally paused, lungs heaving, searching frantically for the next available argument, Jamal delivered 2 words. "Stop talking, Audrey." The words carried the quiet, absolute authority of a man who has made a decision that will not be revisited. The sound of them seemed to physically remove the available oxygen from her lungs. She closed her mouth. Her chest continued to heave with silent, terrified sobs. Jamal raised his left hand with deliberate, unhurried precision. His fingers found the thick gold wedding band on his ring finger. He did not rush the motion, did not perform it dramatically, did not grant it any theatrical weight beyond what it inherently and permanently carried. He drew the band over his knuckle with the quiet, methodical focus of a surgeon completing a final step in a long procedure. He lowered his hand to the mahogany surface of the dining table and placed the ring directly on top of the forensic financial reports. The gold made a single, dull, final sound against the paper. He regarded the ring for one brief, still moment. Then he shifted his gaze directly to his wife, with an expression that contained no residual warmth, no grief, no lingering tenderness, only a cold, crystalline, and calculated contempt that was somehow more final and more shattering than any display of rage could have been. "You do not get to use our innocent children as a human shield to protect yourself from the consequences of your own choices," Jamal said, his voice entirely devoid of the affection it had carried in every previous conversation I had witnessed him have. You used my blood, my exhaustion, and the accumulated hours of every grueling shift I have ever worked to fund a performance that had nothing to do with our family and everything to do with your ego and your family's pathological need for an audience. You chose to subsidize a massive, multi-year fraud instead of securing the future of the children you are now weeping about. Every single time I missed dinner with my kids to perform an emergency surgery, every time I sat in a parking structure at 2 in the morning too depleted to drive home, you were on your phone, rerouting my labor directly into your brother's speculative gambling accounts. He turned his gaze to Brandon with a slow, deliberate precision that caused Brandon to physically recoil. "You are an absolute coward," Jamal said, his words landing with the measured, targeted force of someone who has chosen each one with full awareness of its impact. "You are a weak, arrogant, and fundamentally parasitic individual who steals from the people in his immediate proximity because he lacks the basic competence, the discipline, and the work ethic required to generate anything of value on his own. You took the product of my labor performed in service of people who were sick and frightened and dependent on my skill, and you burned it to the ground in the service of your ego. You are an illusion, Brandon. There is nothing behind the surface. You have built nothing, earned nothing, and now you have nothing." Jamal rose from his chair. His full height cast a long, quiet, unmistakable shadow over the table and everything it held. He buttoned his suit jacket with slow, mechanical precision, the deliberate, composed movements of a man amputating a diseased portion of his existence with full awareness and full intention. "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, Jamal announced, delivering the terms of his response with the flat, final clarity of a legal instrument. "My attorneys will be filing emergency court injunctions. Every joint banking account we share will be frozen immediately. All remaining accessible financial assets will be locked down to prevent any further unauthorized transfers. You will not have access to a single dollar of my surgical income from this point forward. I will commission a fully independent forensic audit of every financial transaction you have executed since the date of our marriage, and my legal team will be filing simultaneously for an immediate, fully contested divorce proceeding. You are going to face the complete and unmitigated legal consequences of what you have done. I will not provide you with a shield. I will not protect your social standing. I will not manage the public fallout of your choices. You made those choices alone, and you will face what follows from them alone." Audrey emitted a sound that bore no resemblance to ordinary human crying, a guttural, broken, wrenching sound that moved through the dining room with the force of something that cannot be contained. She collapsed forward across the table, her hands grasping at empty air where his hands had been moments before, begging him to stop, to reconsider, to think about the children, about the scandal, about the years they had shared and the life they had built. Her pleas meant nothing. Jamal had already completed the separation in his mind, and the audible, physical reality of her grief arrived too late and changed nothing. He turned away from the smoking wreckage of his marriage with the squared shoulders and lifted chin of a man who will carry his grief privately and with full dignity. He directed his gaze toward me. The raw, unforgiving fury that had defined his expression throughout the preceding minutes receded, replaced by something quieter and considerably more considered. A look of genuine, solemn, hard-won respect. We had been targeted by the same predators. We had both been reduced, in the private calculations of this family, to nothing more than productive financial mechanisms to be managed and extracted from. We had both built everything we possessed through years of work that this family had never once genuinely respected while being perfectly willing to consume its products without acknowledgement or gratitude. "Thank you, Olivia," Jamal said. The words were simple, steady, and entirely without performance. "You were not obligated to do any of this. You could have resolved your own situation tonight and left this table without exposing what was being done to me. You chose instead to show me the truth about my own life, regardless of how difficult and how permanent that truth was going to be. You spared me from spending whatever years remain of my career working myself into the ground to feed a system designed entirely to exploit and drain me. I owe you a debt that I am genuinely uncertain how to repay. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the quiet, enormous dignity of the man standing before me. You owe me absolutely nothing, Jamal, I replied, keeping my voice soft and entirely genuine. You deserve to know the truth about who you were married to. Take care of yourself, and take care of your children. Jamal gave me a single nod, measured, respectful, and final. He turned his back on the weeping, disintegrating wreckage of his wife, the shrunken and defeated figure of his brother-in-law, and the utterly destroyed matriarch, whose manufactured empire had just been comprehensively dismantled in the dining room she had treated as her personal dominion. He walked away from the table and through the crowded, openly staring dining room of the Oakwood Country Club, with his broad shoulders perfectly squared and his head held at an elevation that required no justification and invited no commentary. He did not hurry his steps. He did not look backward. He did not grant the destruction behind him even a single backward glance. He simply walked, with the natural, self-possessed authority of a man who has nothing left to prove to any person in any room, through the main double doors and out into the night beyond. He left Audrey wailing at the table, both hands clutching the gold wedding band he had set down among her crimes, her desperate and broken sobs filling every corner of the upscale dining room with the specific, irreversible sound of a person who has finally understood, too late and too completely, that they have destroyed the best thing in their own life with their own hands. The sound of Audrey's wailing filled the vaulted dining room of the Oakwood Country Club with a quality that was difficult to ignore and impossible to look away from. She clutched the gold wedding band Jamal had left behind against her chest, her tears having long since destroyed the expensive, carefully applied makeup that had been part of her costume for the evening. Beside her, Patricia remained entirely catatonic. The disgraced matriarch stared with vacant, unfocused eyes at the federal bankruptcy documents and the matte black corporate card resting on the table before her, her mouth slightly open, her expression that of a person whose internal architecture has simply ceased to function under the weight of what has been revealed. The surrounding elite patrons had entirely abandoned any remaining pretense of looking elsewhere. They watched the spectacular, comprehensive collapse of this fraudulent family with the unabashed, fascinated attention of people witnessing something they will be describing to others for years. Amid the total destruction surrounding me, I kept my posture perfectly composed, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing slow and even. I observed the scene with the detached, precise clarity of a scientist watching the final, predictable stages of a highly volatile chemical reaction she has been observing for months. I knew exactly what the next phase would bring. Predators do not simply surrender when their resources are stripped away and their cover is obliterated. When their primary food source is violently and permanently removed, they redirect their attention with desperate urgency toward the nearest available target. Brandon had been sitting in terrified, diminished silence for the preceding 10 minutes, absorbing the humiliation of Jamal's blistering departure and the public documentation of his catastrophic investment failures. But as he watched his sister's marriage dissolve in real time and observed his mother's decades-long social performance burn to irretrievable ash, something shifted in his demeanor with a visibility that I had been anticipating. The sheer, paralyzing panic that had drained his face of color began to curdle and transform into something darker, more volatile, and considerably more dangerous. He understood with sudden, desperate clarity that the stolen surgical funds were now frozen and permanently beyond his access. The free ride had concluded with absolute finality. His fabricated career as a wealth manager was finished as a viable identity. He needed a new leverage point, and he needed one with immediate effect. Brandon pushed himself upright from his heavy mahogany chair with a deliberateness that suggested premeditated, predatory attention of a man who has identified his only remaining option and intends to pursue it without hesitation or scruple. The pathetic, diminished figure who had been studying the floor vanished, replaced by an aggressive, venomous bully who had convinced himself that he still held a card significant enough to change the outcome of the evening. He planted both hands firmly on the table, knuckles whitening against the polished wood as he leaned his upper body forward and across the surface, in a deliberate invasion of my personal space, attempting through physical proximity to manufacture the intimidation his actual standing no longer commanded. Gideon shifted his weight in a single fluid, silent adjustment, his massive frame coiling with the precise readiness of someone prepared to intervene within a fraction of a second. I raised one finger in a barely perceptible signal. Hold. I wanted Brandon to speak. I wanted every word of what he was about to say to reach exactly as many ears as possible. You actually believe you won tonight? Brandon spat, his voice dropping into a harsh, trembling sneer that carried the specific quality of wounded arrogance. You think you can walk into my mother's club, humiliate every member of my family, dismantle my sister's marriage, expose everything we have spent years building, and simply walk away from this table without consequence? You are genuinely delusional, Olivia. You think that holding a property deed and canceling a few credit cards constitutes real power? You are overlooking one fundamental, inescapable fact. He paused. His chest expanded as he attempted to project an aura of absolute, unassailable dominance. We are legally married, he stated, his voice saturating itself with deliberate menace. And in the full eyes of the law, what belongs to you belongs to me as well. I do not care what kind of corporate shell architecture you constructed around the real estate. I do not care how many forensic reports you printed to impress your little security detail. If you believe you are simply going to discard me from your life and leave me with nothing to show for the years I invested in this marriage, you are walking directly into the most prolonged and devastating legal battle of your existence. I held his gaze without any alteration in my expression, and I allowed him to continue. I am going to file for a fully scorched earth divorce the moment this building opens tomorrow morning, he threatened, the arrogant smirk beginning its gradual, grotesque return to his face. I am going to retain the most aggressive litigation attorneys available in this city, and I will sustain high-profile court proceedings against you for as many years as it requires. I will file for permanent spousal support reflecting the affluent lifestyle I have maintained throughout the duration of our marriage. And most critically of all, I am coming directly for your business. You built that technology company during our marriage, which means I carry a legal entitlement to 50% of every single corporate asset, every active client contract, and every revenue stream it generates. I am going to force a complete liquidation if necessary, and I will drain your corporate accounts through sustained discovery motions and independent forensic accounting audits until you are begging to surrender the penthouse simply to stop the accumulation of legal fees. His ignorance of corporate law, prenuptial asset protection structures, and the specific legal architecture I had spent considerable time and resources constructing around my business was genuinely staggering. I did not interrupt him. I allowed him the full, uninterrupted experience of his false legal confidence, because the moment I chose to address it would be considerably more effective for having been withheld. Brandon leaned incrementally closer, his voice dropping into the conspiratorial register he apparently believed communicated menace. The smell of expensive alcohol on his breath arrived ahead of his next words. But the threatened divorce had been merely his opening maneuver. He was preparing to deliver what he genuinely believed was a decisive, unassailable blow. a corporate extortion that he was certain would permanently and completely guarantee his financial future. His smirk widened into something grotesque and self-congratulatory. You should have invested considerably more attention in the security of your home office, Olivia, he whispered, his tone shifting into a taunting, theatrical hiss that he clearly felt suited the gravity of his revelation. You operated that workspace as though it were a classified military installation. The heavy door, the electronic keypad, the complete prohibition on entry. You conducted yourself as though the files inside represented government intelligence rather than the work product of a private technology firm. But you made a significant and, as it turns out, quite consequential error in your assessment of me. I am not the decorative accessory you chose to believe I was. I kept my face entirely still while every internal system in my body registered a sharp, precise surge of cold, electrified anticipation. For the past month, Brandon continued, practically vibrating with the contained excitement of someone who believes they are about to deliver the definitive move in a game they have already won. I have been watching you. I observed you moving capital and assembling documentation on my family, so I took protective measures of my own during the hours when you were sleeping. I bypassed the electronic keypad on your office door. It was considerably easier to defeat than the confidence you placed in it would suggest. Once inside, I did not merely look around. I accessed your primary desktop computer. I connected an external storage drive and I spent several hours systematically copying everything I could find. He straightened slightly, adjusting his suit jacket with the self-satisfied precision of a man who believes he has just executed a masterpiece. I have your complete client database, Olivia, he announced, his eyes gleaming with the specific, uncontained joy of someone who has confused the appearance of triumph with its substance. I have your financial projections, your proprietary operating procedures, and the complete archive of every confidential communication your company has generated over the preceding 3 years. I have taken the decision to secure my own financial future at your direct expense, and there is not a single action available to you that can reverse or prevent it. Brandon crossed his arms over his chest with the theatrical finality of a man announcing checkmate. He looked down at me with the absolute, unshakable certainty of someone who has just delivered an inescapable strategic conclusion and is waiting to observe the surrender. He had no conception whatsoever that he had just, in a room full of witnesses, confessed to a comprehensive catalog of severe federal crimes. And I was about to use that confession to complete what I had come here tonight to accomplish. His smirk widened further into something that belonged on a different kind of face entirely. He leaned closer, lowering his voice into the theatrical whisper of a man who genuinely believed he was starring in a high-stakes corporate espionage narrative in which he occupied the role of the brilliant, untouchable protagonist. You thought I was simply sitting passively in the background while you plotted against my family? He taunted, his eyes bright with the manic, unearned energy of a man confusing recklessness with intelligence. I located the hidden file directories on your desktop. I found the encrypted folders containing the proprietary source code for your upcoming enterprise software launch. The intellectual property that your venture capital investors are currently valuing at tens of millions of dollars and positioning as the cornerstone of your company's next growth phase. I did not simply copy it onto an inexpensive flash drive. I executed a complete, systematic digital extraction of the entire codebase. Every line, every module, every documentation file. He paused to assess my reaction and, encountering nothing but absolute, unreadable stillness, interpreted my silence as the paralytic terror he was expecting, rather than the controlled, satisfied patience it actually represented. He adjusted his cufflinks with a deliberateness that was almost touchingly self-deluded. I transferred every single line of that source code to a secure offshore holding company I personally established in the Cayman Islands, Brandon declared, dropping the name of the jurisdiction with the self-congratulatory gravity of someone who has just revealed the final, irrefutable element of a master plan. The account structure sits entirely outside United States federal jurisdiction. Your attorneys have zero practical legal reach. The corporate anonymity layers are, as I constructed them, effectively impenetrable. I hold the complete and exclusive keys to your most valuable corporate asset, and it is resting in an account on an island your legal team cannot touch. He paced a short distance beside the table, physically energized by his own narration, desperate to repair the comprehensive damage Jamal's departure had inflicted on whatever remained of his self-concept. The wealthy patrons of the Oakwood Country Club watched with expressions that ranged from disbelief to fascinated horror as the live corporate extortion unfolded beside their untouched entrees. "These are my terms," Brandon announced, pointing a rigid, aggressive finger directly at my face with the practiced authority of a man who has rehearsed this moment extensively. "First, you will transfer the downtown penthouse deed from your corporate holding structure directly into my name, completely and irrevocably, no later than tomorrow afternoon. Second, you will establish a fully funded irrevocable trust to maintain my mother's lifestyle in perpetuity. Her club membership, her vehicles, her social standing, her entire constructed existence, guaranteed and sustained at your expense, indefinitely. Third, you will agree to an uncontested alimony settlement that accurately reflects the level of luxury and social access I have provided you throughout the duration of this marriage. These are non-negotiable. These are your only available options." I watched him, my expression a surface of complete and impenetrable serenity, while somewhere deeper I was marveling with something approaching genuine awe at the breathtaking, almost architectural completeness of his stupidity. He was confessing, in meticulous and enthusiastic detail, to multiple serious federal crimes. He was doing so voluntarily. He was doing so in a crowded, acoustically resonant room full of witnesses. And he was doing so with the beaming, self-congratulatory energy of a man who believes he has just guaranteed his own permanent security. "If you refuse even a single one of these terms," Brandon threatened, driving his fist onto the mahogany table for dramatic punctuation, "I will immediately proceed to auction your proprietary source code to your 3 largest direct competitors. I have already prepared the anonymous communications. A single keystroke is the only distance between your corporate rivals and total, unrestricted access to your most valuable intellectual property. Your software launch will be rendered entirely worthless before it reaches market. Your investors will withdraw their commitments. Your company will collapse. And you will spend the remainder of your professional life defending against shareholder litigation that will bankrupt you permanently and completely." The sound of Brandon's extortion appeared to function as a kind of restorative elixir for Patricia. Across the table, something flickered back to life behind her vacant eyes, a last desperate ember of the manipulative intelligence that had sustained her performance for so many years in rooms exactly like this one. Patricia, who had been sitting in a state of complete catatonic shock since I unveiled her humiliating bankruptcy to the entire dining room, suddenly gasped and snapped bolt upright in her chair. Color flooded rapidly back into her pale, tear-stained cheeks with the speed of someone receiving a sudden and unexpected transfusion of hope. The realization that her golden son had supposedly outmaneuvered the woman who had just publicly dismantled her entire social identity brought an instantaneous and almost miraculous restoration to the disgraced matriarch. Patricia seized a linen cloth napkin and wiped the dark, smeared mascara from beneath her eyes with sharp, efficient strokes. She released a breathless, triumphant laugh that sounded like grinding metal dragged slowly across stone. She pushed herself upright, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer dress with deliberate composure, and walked around to stand directly beside Brandon. She wrapped her arm around his shoulders with proprietary pride, projecting a united and supposedly victorious front to the watching elite crowd gathered around them. "You genuinely believed you could outsmart us, didn't you?" Patricia sneered, her voice instantly recovering that familiar, grating aristocratic superiority she reserved for terrorizing service workers and anyone she considered beneath her station. "You thought you could simply march into this establishment, humiliate me in front of my social peers, and dismantle my family with your printed spreadsheets and your little forensic parlor tricks. You have severely underestimated the bloodline you married into, Olivia. My son possesses a genuinely brilliant financial mind. His business acumen is infinitely superior to your pathetic computer-based amusements." Patricia looked down at me, her eyes blazing with a renewed and venomous arrogance that she had absolutely no basis whatsoever for feeling. She genuinely believed that Brandon's amateur extortion scheme had successfully cornered a nationally recognized cybersecurity executive, that the tables had permanently shifted in their favor, entirely blind to the elegant, precisely constructed trap that was quietly closing around both of them with every word they uttered. "You finally lost, Olivia," Patricia gloated, leaning across the table to ensure her vicious pronouncement landed with maximum impact. "You completely overplayed your hand. You brought this entire spectacular catastrophe upon yourself by refusing to simply hand over a piece of jewelry and demonstrate some basic courtesy toward your betters. If you had shown even a minimal amount of appropriate deference when it was called for, you could have preserved your little company and your comfortable life. But now my son holds your entire professional future in the palm of his hand. You are going to sign over that luxury penthouse. You are going to fully fund my accounts. And then you are going to crawl back to whatever miserable, impoverished origin you crawled out of." She patted Brandon's cheek with theatrical, maternal affection, gazing at him as though he had just returned from a decisive military campaign bearing trophies. "I raised a brilliant, ruthless man," she announced to the surrounding tables in a voice pitched deliberately to Carrie, making one final desperate attempt to salvage the shattered fragments of her public image by aligning herself publicly with her son's supposed victory. "He knows precisely how to protect his family's legacy from greedy, manipulative outsiders who attempt to claim what rightfully belongs to us." I allowed the final resonant echo of Patricia's ridiculous declaration to fade completely into the ambient background of the country club dining room. I did not lower my gaze. I did not allow a single tremor to enter my hands. I did not reach for a napkin or compose my expression into anything resembling distress. Instead, I looked at the two of them, standing there puffed up with the hollow, intoxicating confidence of amateur thieves who believed with absolute sincerity that they had just successfully robbed a heavily fortified vault. And then I laughed. It was not a polished, controlled social chuckle calibrated for the room. It was genuine, melodic, deeply felt, and absolutely chilling. It rose from somewhere deep in my chest and broke through the surface with a naturalness and ease that made it considerably more devastating than any calculated performance could have been. The sound of my authentic amusement sliced through the heavy, suffocating tension of the dining room with the clean efficiency of a freshly honed blade. I tilted my head back slightly, allowing the pure, uncontained comedy of their breathtaking stupidity to wash over me without restraint. The surrounding elite patrons, who had been bracing themselves for a visible display of defeat and submission on my part, exchanged deeply confused and uncertain glances with one another. Patricia's smug, victorious expression faltered with visible immediacy. Her hands dropped to her sides, her posture stiffening as the unaffected, genuine quality of my laughter systematically dismantled the illusion of her dominance. She looked at Brandon in urgent search of reassurance, but Brandon was already taking a small, involuntary half-step backward. He recognized that laugh. He had heard it precisely once before, in a corporate boardroom, when a hostile negotiation team had attempted a leverage play against my company, and I had proceeded to dismantle their entire position in under 4 minutes. "What exactly is so amusing?" Patricia demanded, her voice rapidly losing its cultivated aristocratic edge and pitching upward into a nervous, unsettled register that betrayed everything she was trying to project. "You are staring into the face of absolute financial ruin, Olivia. My son has just comprehensively outsmarted you. There is nothing remotely funny about your impending bankruptcy." I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms with perfect, unhurried grace on the polished mahogany surface. The laughter had ceased, but the cold, predatory amusement remained entirely visible in my eyes, the kind that communicates not entertainment, but complete, total situational control. I locked my gaze on my husband and watched the microscopic tremors beginning to develop in his hands. "Brandon," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority that pulled the undivided attention of every person within earshot, as though a current had passed through the room. "For the entirety of our marriage, you and your mother have sustained a remarkably persistent and profoundly insulting delusion about the nature of my work. Because I do not perform my career in a glass-fronted office tower while wearing a tailored power suit, and because I actually possess a substantive and functional understanding of how server networks and digital infrastructure operate, you convinced yourselves that I was some variety of low-level technical support worker. You called me a computer repair girl not 20 minutes ago from precisely that chair." I paused, allowing the silence to stretch for exactly the number of seconds required to ensure that my next words would arrive with their full and appropriate weight. "I do not fix broken laptops, Brandon," I stated, enunciating each syllable with the precision of someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something and intends for it to be heard correctly. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Digital Defense. We are one of the premier cybersecurity and digital forensics firms in the United States of America. My company secures the encrypted networks of multinational banking institutions, defense contractors, and federal intelligence agencies. I employ some of the most ruthless, brilliant, and rigorously ethical hackers and security architects currently operating anywhere on the planet. I build impenetrable digital fortresses for a living. That is what I do." Brandon stared at me as the color evacuated his face with a speed that rendered his skin almost translucent. His mouth opened. His vocal cords produced nothing. The arrogant corporate raider persona he had been projecting with such enthusiasm just moments before evaporated completely, leaving in its place a terrified, thoroughly incompetent amateur who was beginning to understand, with dawning and comprehensive horror, that he had just walked blindfolded and barefoot into a minefield. "You genuinely believed you could bypass the security protocols of my home office network?" I continued, my tone descending into the register of icy, clinical condescension that I reserved for situations that genuinely warranted it. "You considered yourself a mastermind because you correctly guessed the physical passcode on a heavy oak door. Brandon, the electronic keypad lock on that door is a decorative prop. The actual security perimeter of my workspace begins at the precise moment any unauthorized device makes contact with my local network environment." Patricia looked frantically back and forth between her son and me, her extremely limited understanding of digital technology severely impeding her ability to fully grasp the dimensions of the catastrophe currently unfolding. "Brandon, what is she talking about?" Patricia hissed, seizing his arm and shaking it with urgent, anxious force. "Tell her to stop talking. Tell her you have the files. Tell her it's over." "He does have the files, Patricia," I confirmed smoothly, maintaining absolute, unbroken eye contact with my husband's horrified face. "He absolutely and successfully transferred a very substantial data payload to his shell company in the Cayman Islands. But what he transferred was not my proprietary source code. It was not the intellectual property underpinning my upcoming enterprise software launch. My actual source code resides on a heavily air-gapped server in a subterranean biometric vault in a facility on the other side of the country. It is never, under any operational circumstances whatsoever, stored on a local desktop computer in a residential penthouse. I watched Brandon's chest begin to heave as his body struggled to draw sufficient oxygen into his panicking lungs. The realization was arriving with the force and finality of a physical blow. "So what exactly did you steal, Brandon?" I asked, tilting my head with a measured, deliberate mockery. "Allow me to answer that for you. You stole a honeypot." I spoke with perfect clarity, ensuring the assembled audience fully understood the precise mechanics of his comprehensive and irreversible failure. "For the past month, I observed your clumsy, transparent attempts to probe my network traffic and map my file architecture. You left digital fingerprints on every surface you touched. You were approximately as subtle and stealthy as a bulldozer being driven through the center of a glass house. Rather than locking you out and triggering a suspicious confrontation, my team and I made a different and considerably more interesting decision. We left the front door wide open. We constructed a beautifully labeled, highly enticing decoy directory on my desktop and named it using the exact project designations we knew you were specifically searching for. We wrapped it in a superficial layer of basic encryption, just sufficient to make you feel a genuine sense of accomplishment when you cracked it. And we waited. Brandon's knees buckled with visible and unmistakable force. He seized the back of his heavy dining chair with both hands, using the furniture as a structural support to prevent himself from collapsing entirely onto the floor. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, panicked bursts. "But that directory contained no software," I continued, delivering the technical reality with the clean, unhurried precision of a surgeon completing a particularly satisfying procedure. "It contained a highly reactive, custom-built, military-grade tracking payload. It is a specialized piece of forensic malware developed exclusively within my company for the purpose of hunting and documenting corporate espionage vectors. The exact second you inserted your external hard drive into my desktop computer, you infected your own device with it. And the exact second you initiated that wire transfer to your offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, you carried my tracking beacon directly through the jurisdictional firewall and planted it at the heart of your own private server infrastructure." Patricia emitted a small, confused, involuntary sound. She did not comprehend the technical vocabulary being deployed, but she understood with absolute and devastating clarity the look of complete, soul-crushing defeat that had settled like a physical weight across the entirety of her son's body. "You did not secure your financial future tonight, Brandon," I concluded, my voice descending to its final lethal register. "What you actually did was hand the chief executive officer of a national cybersecurity firm a direct, unobstructed backdoor access tunnel into every single hidden account, every illegal wire transfer, and every fraudulent shell company you have ever created or utilized. You swallowed the bait completely and entirely, and in doing so, you dragged the hook deep into your own stomach. You are not a brilliant mastermind holding my company's future hostage. You are a profoundly and irreversibly foolish man who just personally delivered the complete documented evidence of his own crimes directly to his executioner." The dining room of the Oakwood Country Club was utterly, completely silent. The live corporate blackmail had not merely failed, it had been meticulously, flawlessly, and comprehensively reversed, trapping the predator inside a cage he had constructed with his own hands and his own voice. Brandon stared at me. In his eyes was a pure, unadulterated terror that had finally achieved a scale commensurate with the severity and breadth of the crimes he had just so enthusiastically confessed to committing. The smug, untouchable corporate raider persona he had performed with such conviction just minutes earlier had dissolved completely, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. He had dug himself with nothing but arrogance and spectacular incompetence. He opened his mouth in desperate search of a response, a witty deflection, a legal technicality, anything at all. But his vocal cords had staged a complete and total revolt. His jaw worked in silence. A thick bead of cold sweat formed at his hairline and tracked slowly down his pale temple, disappearing into the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit. He gripped the back of his heavy dining chair with a force that turned his knuckles stark white against the dark wood, using the furniture as the only available mechanism keeping his buckling legs from depositing him onto the floor. Patricia, entirely bewildered by the highly technical architecture of her son's downfall and unable to locate a single foothold of comprehension within it, grabbed Brandon's forearm and shook it with frantic, escalating urgency. "Brandon, say something," she demanded in a shrill, panicked whisper that carried with embarrassing clarity through the deathly quiet of the dining room. "Tell her she is bluffing. Tell her you still hold the advantage. You cannot simply stand there and allow this woman to address you this way. Do something. Do anything. Right now." But Brandon could not do a single thing. He could not move. He could not speak. He could not even redirect his gaze from my face, which he stared at with a horrified, dawning, and utterly complete comprehension of the catastrophic error he had made. He finally, fully understood what had actually occurred. He had not hacked my system. I had extended him a cordial and carefully designed invitation, handed him a weapon that was pointed in precisely one direction, and watched with patient satisfaction as he picked it up and aimed it at the center of his own forehead. "I am afraid that Brandon is currently without options of any variety, Patricia," I stated, my voice projecting with a calm, surgical precision that commanded the full and undivided attention of every elite patron currently eavesdropping on our table. "He cannot negotiate his way out of a digital snare that has already closed completely around him. But the finest, most genuinely satisfying element of this entire evening is that my digital honeypot was only the first half of the trap." I raised my right hand slowly and with deliberate, unhurried grace. I brought my fingertips to my collarbone and touched the deep blue sapphire and diamond necklace resting against my skin. The precise piece of jewelry Patricia had so viciously and publicly demanded I surrender to her daughter. The very necklace she had lunged across the table to physically tear from my throat before Gideon had intervened and redirected her ambitions. "You were extraordinarily determined to acquire this necklace tonight, Patricia," I remarked, tracing the intricate silver setting with the tip of my index finger. "You declared it was being wasted on me. You insisted it rightfully belonged against the neck of a woman of genuine social standing, someone like Audrey, who could do it proper justice at a prestigious hospital gala. Brandon even had the remarkable audacity to dismiss it as a decorative trinket to keep me occupied and distracted. It is genuinely, profoundly poetic that you coveted this specific item with such aggressive single-mindedness, because you had absolutely no idea whatsoever what you were actually attempting to take." I lowered my hand back to my lap, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my trembling husband. "This necklace is, as I stated, a deeply cherished family heirloom," I explained, my voice carrying the measured, unhurried cadence of someone delivering information they have been looking forward to sharing for quite some time. However, several months ago, when I first began developing serious and well-founded suspicions about the unauthorized movement of capital through accounts connected to this family, I brought this piece of jewelry to the hardware engineering division of Vanguard Digital Defense. My senior technicians invested 3 full days in the meticulous, precise process of retrofitting the heavy silver casing surrounding the central sapphire. Brandon released a strangled, breathless sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. His eyes locked onto the necklace with a new and terrible wave of dread washing visibly across his features. They carefully hollowed out the interior of the pendant and installed a state-of-the-art, military-grade micro-recording device, I revealed, allowing each component of the revelation to land with its full individual weight before proceeding to the next. It is equipped with an advanced noise-canceling audio processor and an extraordinarily powerful cellular transmitter. It does not merely capture and store audio on an internal memory chip, Brandon. It streams a live, fully encrypted, high-definition audio feed directly to my company's secure servers in real time, continuously and without interruption. The silence in the Oakwood Country Club at that moment was of a quality and completeness that I had never previously encountered in any room of that size. The wealthy onlookers, the waitstaff, the country club manager standing near the entrance, who had arrived intending to manage the situation and had instead found himself completely unable to move. Every single person present had arrived at the simultaneous realization that they were not witnessing a marital dispute or a financial disagreement. They were witnessing, in real time, a live and fully operational sting. "Every single word you have spoken in my presence this evening," I continued, driving each point home with the methodical, relentless precision of someone who has prepared this moment with great care and intends to ensure it is complete, "has been captured, transmitted, and permanently archived. Your aggressive demands for my legally owned property, your detailed and enthusiastic threats of a scorched earth divorce designed to strip my company from me, your proud, step-by-step confession of bypassing my home office security system, your explicit admission of connecting an external device to my computer and systematically copying what you believed to be my proprietary enterprise source code. And most critically, most consequentially, and most perfectly of all, your explicit, detailed, voluntary attempt at corporate extortion, in which you threatened to auction my intellectual property to my direct competitors unless I transferred a luxury penthouse into your name and established a permanent financial endowment for your mother's lifestyle. Every syllable of that malicious blackmail has been captured with complete fidelity, permanently recorded and securely archived on servers that no attorney you could possibly retain will ever reach." Patricia let out a faint, reedy sound and stumbled backward until the edge of the dining table caught her hips and prevented her from going further. She pressed both hands over her mouth, staring at the glittering blue jewel at my collarbone as though it had transformed before her eyes into something dangerous and alive. The full, devastating realization arrived that her own arrogant, triumphant cheering from the sidelines, her own eager prompting and endorsement of her son's extortion scheme, had been captured with equal fidelity and would serve with equal effectiveness in securing his prosecution. "You see, Brandon," I elaborated, my tone shifting into the cool, precise, analytical cadence of someone who has spent considerable time in proximity to federal legal proceedings. "Digital forensic evidence is an extraordinarily powerful instrument. The server logs, the malicious payload tracking data, and the offshore routing number documentation are all deeply compelling tools for establishing that a data breach occurred and tracing its precise technical execution. However, experienced defense attorneys operating at the federal level are remarkably resourceful. They will stand before a jury and argue with straight-faced conviction that you accidentally clicked a malicious link, or that a sophisticated third-party actor remotely accessed your device and used it to execute the transfer without your knowledge or consent. They will argue a complete absence of conscious criminal intent. They will characterize the entire affair as a sequence of unfortunate technical accidents for which you bear no meaningful personal responsibility." I leaned forward by a measured degree, closing the distance between us just sufficiently to ensure he felt the full, crushing weight of what was coming. To guarantee a federal conviction that survives appeal, I needed to establish criminal intent beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt. I needed the federal prosecutors assigned to this case to possess an irrefutable, bulletproof record of exactly why you committed the breach, precisely where you directed the stolen data, and exactly what you intended to do with it in exchange for your demands. I needed your motive, your method, and your explicit extortion demand. All in your own voice, all delivered voluntarily, and all permanently documented. I offered him a smile that was chilling in its completeness. And you delivered every last piece of that final evidential puzzle to me on a silver platter, because your ego simply could not survive the evening without gloating. Your fragile, enormous sense of self-importance demanded that you describe your supposed brilliance out loud, in detail, in a room full of witnesses, to your mother, and to a collection of wealthy strangers whose admiration you have been performing for your entire adult life. You explicitly detailed your extortion demands. You named the Cayman Islands as your offshore destination, with something approaching pride. You verbally confirmed every single operative element of the crime using your own voice, of your own volition, without a single prompt from anyone at this table. Brandon slumped forward with the weight of a man whose spine has simply ceased to function, bracing himself against the table with both hands. His breathing had deteriorated into rapid, shallow hyperventilation, his chest convulsing in small, desperate bursts. The arrogant mastermind who had threatened to reduce my company to rubble and bankrupt me into permanent submission 5 minutes prior had ceased to exist. In his place was a broken, comprehensively terrified criminal who had just arrived at the full understanding that he had dictated his own federal indictment directly into a recording device while voluntarily providing witnesses. Right now, at this precise moment, I concluded, allowing my voice to carry the final, absolute, uncompromising authority of a verdict being read aloud in a courtroom. A team of my senior threat analysts is seated in a secure control room, processing the audio file you so generously and voluntarily provided over the course of this dinner. They are packaging your recorded confession alongside the complete forensic data trace generated by the honeypot payload you downloaded and carried across an international jurisdictional boundary. You believed you were executing a flawless corporate acquisition tonight, Brandon. The only thing you successfully executed was your own permanent and comprehensive destruction. The trap is completely and irreversibly closed. There is no exit, no negotiation, no version of events that will produce a different outcome for you from this point forward. I allowed the absolute finality of that statement to occupy the chilled, crystalline air of the dining room for a long, measured, and thoroughly satisfying moment. Brandon appeared to have experienced a substantial increase in the gravitational force acting specifically upon his body. He looked as though the floor were exerting a magnetic pull on him that his legs were no longer entirely capable of resisting. His breath arrived in ragged, audible gasps, his chest heaving beneath his tailored shirt, with the desperate irregularity of a man whose body is responding to a threat that his mind is still struggling to fully process. The elite members of the Oakwood Country Club sat at their surrounding tables in a collective paralysis, their expensive, carefully prepared meals growing cold and entirely forgotten as they witnessed the systematic, surgical dismantling of a man who had sat down at dinner believing himself untouchable. I was not finished. A true digital forensics professional does not merely identify a breach and allow the details to speak for themselves. We catalog every individual violation with the comprehensive precision required to ensure the legal architecture surrounding a prosecution is completely and inescapably sound. Brandon, I continued, my voice adopting the sharp, deliberate cadence of a federal prosecutor delivering the structured foundation of an opening statement. When you made the conscious decision to bypass my security protocols and access a device belonging to Vanguard Digital Defense, you did not commit the act of a suspicious spouse reviewing a partner's personal correspondence. You committed a direct and unambiguous violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That is a severe federal criminal statute carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for a first offense, with enhanced penalties available depending on the assessed scope of the intended financial harm. Patricia emitted a strangled, pathetic whimper, her hands flying upward to cover her mouth. She stared at her son, the golden boy she had spent decades elevating and defending and performing maternal pride on behalf of, and appeared to be involuntarily constructing a visual image of him in institutional clothing rather than his custom Italian suit. But you did not stop there, I continued, taking a single deliberate step closer to the table and holding his gaze with the implacable steadiness of someone who has no remaining uncertainty about any aspect of what they are doing. Gideon remained directly behind me, a towering, immovable presence radiating a quiet authority that kept every member of the family pinned precisely where they were. When you packaged what you believed to be my proprietary enterprise software and initiated a transfer of that data to an unauthorized offshore entity, you triggered the Economic Espionage Act. You stated your explicit intention to sell the stolen material to my corporate competitors for your own direct financial gain. That statute adds a potential sentence of 15 years and a financial penalty reaching $5 million. And let us be entirely precise about the extortion demand you recorded so helpfully onto my necklace, demanding the transfer of a luxury property and a lifetime financial endowment in exchange for not releasing stolen data falls squarely, completely, and without any ambiguity under federal blackmail and extortion statutes, which carry their own substantial and consecutive sentencing exposure. Brandon shook his head from side to side in a slow, weak, mechanical denial. He formed the beginning shapes of words that failed to materialize into anything coherent. Perhaps the outline of an apology, perhaps the ghost of a plea. But his vocal cords had lost the ability to produce organized sound under the weight of the cumulative prison time I was enumerating with quiet, methodical precision in front of the people whose respect he had spent his entire adult life performing for. The most genuinely breathtaking element of your operational methodology tonight, Brandon, I stated, my tone transitioning from legal analysis into something closer to professional disbelief, was your selection of infrastructure. I monitored the network routing logs in real time as your transfer initiated. You did not use an untraceable burner device with no registered identity. You did not route the transfer through a heavily encrypted virtual private network accessed from an anonymous public location. You executed a massive international data exfiltration operation using the heavily regulated, meticulously monitored, federally compliant servers belonging to your own wealth management employer. The realization landed with the force and precision of a perfectly placed strike. His eyes bulged. His hands flew to his head, fingers seizing his hair with the desperate, involuntary grip of a man whose entire understanding of his own situation has just been catastrophically revised in a single moment. The color that had already largely departed his face found whatever remained and took it with it. Did you genuinely believe that a premier licensed financial institution operating under federal regulatory oversight would fail to detect a massive encrypted data packet departing their secure internal network and traveling directly to a known offshore tax haven? I asked, allowing a degree of measured, clinical incredulity into my voice that I felt was entirely warranted. Financial institutions of that category operate under extraordinarily strict federal compliance frameworks. By utilizing your employer's regulated infrastructure to execute your scheme, you bypass their internal security protocols, triggered automated federal monitoring alerts across multiple systems simultaneously, and activated international flags for both money laundering and corporate espionage. You did not just implicate yourself, Brandon. You dragged a federally licensed financial institution's infrastructure into an active criminal investigation as the vehicle of the offense. Patricia seized Brandon's arm with both hands, her manicured nails driving visibly into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. Brandon, tell me this is not what happened, she begged in a shrill, frantic hiss that cut through the quiet dining room with the subtlety of a fire alarm. Tell me you did not use your office computer. Tell me you did not do this at work. Tell me you did not destroy your career. He could not answer her. He was hyperventilating fully now, his eyes moving in rapid, unfocused arcs around the room, as though his body were independently scanning the exits and calculating distances with the frantic instinct of a man who has just realized there are none. He understood with complete and total finality that he had not merely attacked his wife. He had actively and irrefutably dragged his highly prestigious, heavily regulated employer into the center of a federal cybercrime investigation, transforming their secure network infrastructure into a documented crime scene with his own hands. You utilized a licensed wealth management network to facilitate international data theft, I clarified, ensuring the executives and financial professionals seated at the surrounding tables, people with their own substantial portfolios and fiduciary obligations, fully understood the precise nature of the threat Brandon represented to any institution that had the misfortune of being associated with him. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not approach unauthorized offshore data transfers executed through regulated financial infrastructure as minor compliance irregularities. You converted your firm's secure corporate network into an active and fully documented federal crime scene, Brandon. The implications for their regulatory standing alone will ensure that their cooperation with the investigation is both immediate and comprehensive. Precisely on cue, the subtle rhythmic vibration of my phone registered against my leg from within my designer bag. I did not hurry. I maintained my perfectly composed posture, holding Brandon's terrified gaze for an additional, deliberate, thoroughly satisfying moment before reaching down to retrieve the device with unhurried ease. The screen illuminated with a high-priority encrypted message from my senior incident response director. I unlocked the device and read the brief, carefully anticipated text. A slow, glacial smile spread across my face, the particular smile of a chess player watching the opposing king complete its final, involuntary movement into an inescapable position on a board that was never arranged for any other outcome. I looked back at my husband, whose entire existence was at that moment suspended from a single, rapidly fraying thread. I have just received confirmation from my team, I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating quiet of the Oakwood Country Club with the clean, absolute certainty of a blade finding its mark. When your unauthorized transfer triggered the federal compliance alerts, my cybersecurity analysts made immediate contact with the chief compliance officer at your wealth management firm. We provided them with the complete digital forensic documentation, the precise event timestamps, and the specific routing protocols you employed to exfiltrate the data from their network. Brandon released a low, agonizing groan from somewhere deep within his chest. He slumped forward, burying his face in both hands, the physical architecture of his composure collapsing completely and entirely in front of the very people whose esteem had been the primary organizing principle of his adult life. As we are speaking, I continued, delivering each component of his professional annihilation with the steady, measured pacing of someone who understands the value of allowing devastation to land completely before the next arrives. Your employer's internal security team, operating in direct and active coordination with my digital forensics specialists, has executed a full lockdown of your office. Your desktop computer has been physically seized and is currently in the custody of their compliance department. Your company-issued mobile devices have been confiscated. Your building access credentials have been permanently and irrevocably revoked. Your corporate email account has been deactivated. Your client portfolios have been frozen and are in the process of being reassigned to other managers, effective immediately, pending the outcome of a full federal investigation into the unauthorized use of their network infrastructure. Patricia released her grip on Brandon's arm with the abrupt, final quality of someone letting go of something they have just recognized as irrecoverable. She sank back into her heavy mahogany dining chair with the slow, heavy motion of a structure that has lost its internal support. The comprehensive illusion of her golden child, the prestigious wealth manager who validated her social standing and justified her decades of manufactured prestige, had been permanently and irreversibly obliterated in front of the precise audience whose opinion she had spent the longest constructing it for. Your career in the financial services sector is officially and completely over, Brandon, I stated, my tone carrying zero sympathy and zero performance of it. You will not manage another portfolio. You will not hold a financial license in any jurisdiction in this country again. You are radioactive to every reputable firm operating within the industry. You attempted to reduce my company to ash in order to secure a permanent and unearned life of luxury, and the only structure you succeeded in burning to the ground was the one you had built your entire identity on top of. The crushing totality of his professional destruction anchored Brandon to his chair with a weight that appeared genuinely physical. His breathing had shallowed to the point of visible inadequacy, his eyes fixed on the pristine white tablecloth as though it contained an exit he had not yet located. Patricia sat beside him with her mouth slightly open and her manicured hands trembling with a visible, uncontrolled tremor in her lap. The illusion of the prestigious family she had spent a lifetime manufacturing and defending and performing had been reduced to fine powder and scattered with complete thoroughness across the expensive dining room floor. The silence enveloping our VIP table carried a quality of weight and finality that I suspect none of the surrounding patrons had encountered before in that room or in any room quite like it. The elite membership of the Oakwood Country Club sat captivated, transfixed by the complete catastrophic implosion of a man they had previously accepted as a peer and a participant in their world. The soft jazz filtering through the concealed ceiling speakers sounded genuinely, absurdly mismatched against the backdrop of a life in the process of being permanently and comprehensively ended. Then, the ambient warm lighting of the dining room underwent an abrupt and jarring shift in character. Through the grand floor-to-ceiling glass windows lining the far wall, windows that overlooked the carefully manicured entrance driveway of the club, the quiet darkness of the evening outside was violently and rhythmically disrupted. Frantic pulses of brilliant red and blue light began bouncing off the thick glass panes, casting long, irregular, strobing shadows across the expensive mahogany tables, the crystal chandeliers, and the faces of the assembled elite patrons. The reflections swept across the room in alternating waves, instantly pulling every gaze away from our table and toward the front entrance with the involuntary, irresistible force of an emergency. Confused murmurs of alarm rippled through the dining room like the first tremor before something larger. People shifted in their chairs, craning to see past the velvet drapes and the glass. The flashing red and blue light painted Brandon's already pale, terrified face in alternating pulses of a color that communicated, with no requirement for interpretation, exactly what was arriving and exactly why. He knew what those lights meant. He had always known, somewhere beneath the arrogance and the performance, that they were inevitable. The tracking beacon I had allowed him to carry away inside his stolen data payload had provided a precise, complete, and legally admissible digital roadmap directly to his location. The tension in the room escalated from confused curiosity to something closer to collective, breath-held dread. The heavy, ornate double doors leading into the main dining hall swung open with a forceful, resonant impact that caused several nearby patrons to flinch noticeably in their seats. The general manager of the Oakwood Country Club entered the room at something considerably less dignified than his customary pace. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson, and a visible sheen of cold perspiration coated his forehead with the particular quality of a man who has just been handed a situation that is entirely outside his professional experience and well beyond his ability to manage. His eyes swept the room with frantic urgency before locking onto our central VIP table. His normally confident, proprietary stride had been replaced by something rushed and genuinely panicked. Following closely behind him were two figures whose presence in that particular environment produced an immediate and instinctive recalibration of the room's entire atmosphere. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and deliberate, dressed in the kind of dark, understated suits that communicate a specific and unmistakable form of authority without requiring any supplementary signaling. They moved through the opulent space with the synchronized, predatory efficiency of people for whom every room they enter becomes, by simple virtue of their presence, a professional environment. They did not glance at the decor. They did not acknowledge the staring billionaires and socialites on either side of their path. Coiled, transparent earpieces disappeared behind their collars, and heavy gold shields were clipped to their belts, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers with each measured, purposeful step. They moved like men who owned the room the moment their feet crossed the threshold. The club manager reached our table slightly ahead of them, visibly out of breath and thoroughly overwhelmed. He wrung his hands together in a gesture of helpless, involuntary distress, looking between Patricia, Brandon, and me with the expression of a man who desperately needs the situation to resolve itself without requiring him to make any meaningful decision. He opened his mouth. His voice cracked and failed to produce anything that constituted a complete sentence. He was caught between the deep professional imperative of not offending his most prominent and long-standing members and the absolute powerlessness of standing in the path of federal authority that had already decided where it was going. He stepped aside hastily, clearing the final distance as the two agents closed in on our table with the unhurried certainty of people who have never once in their professional lives needed to hurry. Patricia let out a sharp, involuntary gasp and pressed her back firmly against her chair as they approached. Her eyes were fixed on the gold badges clipped to their waistbands with the kind of locked, helpless attention that belongs to someone watching something inevitable arrive. The reality of her son's amateur corporate espionage had ceased to be an abstract collection of legal terminology and financial forensics. It had become a physical, immediate, unavoidable presence, standing 3 feet away from her in a dark suit and federal credentials. Gideon, maintaining his position directly behind my chair with the impassive steadiness he had sustained throughout the entire evening, shifted his stance by a single, subtle degree. He recognized fellow professionals in the specific wordless way that people who operate in overlapping disciplines recognize each other. A silent, mutual, and complete understanding passed between my security chief and the approaching agents without a single word or gesture being exchanged. The professional world that Gideon occupied and the professional world these men occupied were adjacent, and they both understood the geometry of the situation without requiring any explanation of it. The agents bypassed the club manager without acknowledgement and moved directly to Brandon, positioning themselves with practiced, fluid precision on either side of his heavy dining chair, creating a physical enclosure around him that made the nature and purpose of their presence unmistakably clear to everyone in the room. The illusion of the Oakwood Country Club as an untouchable, exclusive sanctuary governed by its own elevated social physics. A space where the ordinary consequences of ordinary behavior simply did not apply to the right kind of people, died in that precise and specific moment. The elite patrons who had spent the entire evening performing the elaborate pretense of not listening to our confrontation, while absorbing every syllable of it with intense and fascinated attention, entirely abandoned the performance. Silver forks came to rest on china plates with small, delicate sounds. Crystal wine glasses were lowered to tables. Every head in the brilliantly illuminated cavernous dining room turned with open, unabashed attention toward the spectacle unfolding at the central VIP table. The high society audience watched in absolute, mesmerized stillness as the supposedly impenetrable membrane separating their world from the ordinary world of laws and consequences was effortlessly and matter-of-factly pierced by two men in dark suits carrying federal credentials. Brandon remained slumped in his chair, immobilized by a fear so complete and physical that it appeared to have temporarily suspended several of his basic biological functions. He did not attempt to stand. He did not attempt to speak. He stared at the dark fabric of the suit jacket of the agent positioned closest to him with the blank, vacant fixation of a man whose mind has temporarily abandoned the task of generating responses to external stimuli. Brandon. The lead agent's voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried without effort across the dead silence of the dining room, reaching every corner of the space with the complete ease of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms that were not quiet. "We are special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need you to stand up and step away from the table immediately." The words settled into the room with a weight and finality that no subsequent event could revise or diminish. There was no social maneuver available. There was no leveraging of his mother's fabricated social standing, no invocation of club membership or professional reputation, no performance of wealth or status that was capable of making the two men in front of him redirect their attention elsewhere tonight. He had committed serious federal crimes, and the accumulated weight of those crimes had arrived, as it always eventually does, to collect its due. In the most public, most irreversible, and most comprehensively witnessed manner that the circumstances allowed. The lead agent did not repeat himself. He reached out with a large, unhurried hand and gripped Brandon firmly by the upper arm, drawing my husband upward from his heavy mahogany dining chair with the practiced, economical efficiency of someone who has performed this precise action a very great many times. Brandon's legs were substantially less functional than normal. He swayed on his feet with the unsteady, disconnected quality of a marionette whose operator has loosened the strings without fully releasing them. His expensive leather shoes found uncertain purchase against the polished marble floor. "Brandon, you are under arrest for multiple federal violations," the agent stated, his voice carrying the steady, rhythmic quality of a formal, procedural declaration being delivered with complete professional composure. "The charges include federal wire fraud, unauthorized access to protected computer networks under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and international corporate espionage. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." The Miranda rights echoed through the silent, opulent dining room of the Oakwood Country Club with a clarity that ensured every person present heard and understood every word. The assembled wealthy patrons sat in suspended, breathless attention, observing the spectacular and irreversible conclusion of an evening that none of them would ever entirely forget or stop telling people about. Brandon's eyes swept the room in a final, desperate arc, seeking a sympathetic face, a familiar expression of support, an escape route, a miracle, and found none of those things. The crushing physical reality of the federal charges penetrated the last remaining layer of his denial and his arrogance with a completeness that was almost gentle in its thoroughness. His facade did not shatter dramatically, it simply ceased to exist. "Wait! This is a serious mistake," Brandon stammered, his voice fracturing into a high, desperate register that bore no resemblance to the commanding, authoritative tone he had been deploying all evening. His hands rose defensively, palms outward, as though he genuinely believed he could physically stop the forward momentum of a federal arrest with an open hand. "You do not understand the situation. This is a private matter between a husband and wife. We are legally married. You cannot arrest a man for accessing his own wife's home computer. We share property. We share assets. This is a domestic dispute, not a federal criminal matter." He turned his terrified, pleading eyes toward me with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the last available door is the one he burned himself. He actually expected me to intervene on his behalf, after threatening to obliterate my business. After attempting to extort a luxury property and a lifetime financial endowment from me using stolen data he believed he held. After confessing his crimes in enthusiastic detail into a recording device I was wearing around my neck. After years of condescension and dismissal and allowing his family to treat me as an inconvenience to be managed. After all of it, he genuinely believed I would step forward and call off the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Olivia, please tell them," he begged, his voice dissolving into something small and desperate and entirely unrecognizable from the man who had been threatening my company's destruction 15 minutes prior. "Tell them it was just an argument. Tell them I had authorization to use your network. Tell them this was all a misunderstanding between a husband and his wife. Please, Olivia. Please." I did not move a single muscle. I sat in my chair with immaculate posture, my expression a surface of absolute, freezing, and complete indifference. I looked at him across the space between us, the space that felt, in that moment, like the entire accumulated distance of every insult, every dismissal, every moment of deliberate diminishment. And I allowed my silence to serve as the final, most devastating, and most permanent answer to everything he had ever asked of me. I had built the trap. I had watched him walk into it with the enthusiasm of a man who believed himself untouchable, and I was entirely, completely, and profoundly content to watch the steel jaws close around him with the quiet, inevitable finality I had always known they would. The federal agents were entirely unmoved by his frantic bargaining. They had executed hundreds of high-profile white-collar arrests across their careers, and they were comprehensively immune to the panicked, contradictory pleading of a cornered individual who has just arrived at the understanding that there is no remaining play. "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." The second agent moved behind Brandon with practiced, fluid efficiency, making the instruction sound less like a request and more like the announcement of something that was already happening. Brandon did not comply. He continued to stammer, his words colliding with each other in a disorganized stream of financial jargon and desperate domestic justifications. The second agent did not wait for voluntary compliance. He took hold of Brandon's wrists with a firm, practiced grip and drew his arms behind his back with the unhurried precision of someone performing a task they have performed many times before. The sound that followed, the sharp, unmistakable mechanical ratcheting of heavy steel being drawn through its mechanism and locking into position, moved through the dead quiet dining room of the Oakwood Country Club with a clarity and permanence that seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves. The handcuffs closed around Brandon's wrists with a finality that no amount of money, no quantity of performance, no social connection, and no fabricated prestige would be able to unlock before a federal judge made a deliberate decision to do so. The cold steel rested against the French-stitched cuffs of his custom-tailored Italian suit. A contrast of such complete and absolute symbolic clarity that several of the surrounding patrons appeared to be committing it involuntarily and permanently to memory. That sound was the specific catalyst that finally and completely dissolved Patricia's catatonic state. The disgraced matriarch who had arrived at the Oakwood Country Club that evening, believing herself entitled to demand my mother's necklace, to command my submission, and to preside over her family's manufactured empire from a position of untouchable social authority, snapped. The sight of her golden child, her prestigious wealth manager's son, standing in the center of her exclusive social sanctuary in federal handcuffs, broke whatever remained of her grip on coherent function. Patricia released a guttural, agonizing sound that tore through the elegant space with a rawness entirely incompatible with every surface element of the environment surrounding it. It was not the refined gasp of a woman in shock. It was the primal animal wailing of someone watching the entirety of what they have built and pretended and fought for and maintained reduce itself to nothing simultaneously and in public. She pushed herself upright from the table, but her legs refused to sustain her weight. She collapsed onto the expensive marble floor with the full, uncontrolled weight of a person whose body has decided to respond to psychological catastrophe with complete physical surrender. Her designer dress bunched around her in an undignified heap against the cold marble tiles. She did not register the stares of the elite patrons. She did not experience the social awareness that had governed every moment of her public existence for the past several decades. The terror of watching her son be taken away in federal custody, and the sudden, absolute comprehension of what the permanent loss of my financial support meant for her own survival, drove everything else entirely from her consciousness. Patricia crawled across the polished marble floor. Her hands moved in frantic, scrambling contact with the cold tiles until she reached the legs of my chair. She lunged forward and seized the hem of my black evening gown in both trembling hands, with a grip that communicated complete, absolute desperation. She tilted her face upward toward mine with an expression that had been stripped of every layer of pretension, performance, and cultivated superiority, leaving behind only the raw, terrified face of a woman who has run out of options and is looking at the last available door. "Olivia, please," Patricia begged, her voice a shredded, hysterical sob that bore no resemblance to the commanding aristocratic register she had wielded all evening. "You have the money, you have the connections, you have the power to make this stop. Pay his bail, call your attorneys and instruct them to withdraw the charges. I am begging you on my knees. Please do not allow them to take my son. He is a good man who made a terrible error in judgment. He should not go to a federal prison. Please." I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor at my feet, clutching the fabric of my dress with white-knuckled, trembling hands and streaming tears onto the expensive silk. This was the woman who had spent years mocking my background with specific, deliberate cruelty, who had called me a computer repair girl to my face and to every wealthy acquaintance she wanted to impress with her son's elevated marital circumstances, who had attempted, not 90 minutes ago, to physically lunge across a dining table and tear my late mother's necklace from my throat, who had sat at that table cheering her son's attempted extortion of my life's work with the gleeful, triumphant energy of a woman who believed she had finally, permanently won. And now she was on the floor, clutching my dress, begging. "I will do anything you want, Olivia," Patricia sobbed, her tears soaking into the expensive fabric of my gown in dark, spreading stains. "I will never speak to you with disrespect again. I will never make demands. I will never ask for anything. I will be a genuine, supportive presence in your life. I will treat you with the respect and acknowledgement you have always deserved. Just please, write a check. Make a call. Save my family. I am on my knees in front of you, in front of all these people, asking you for mercy." The desperate, humiliating promise echoed in the space around us, an offering to transform her entire character and personality, delivered with the specific, transactional sincerity of someone who has no remaining leverage and is attempting to manufacture new terms from scratch. She was not experiencing remorse. She was not experiencing genuine recognition of the years of harm she had inflicted with deliberate and sustained cruelty. She was experiencing the specific and unromantic terror of someone whose supply of resources has been permanently cut and who is attempting to negotiate their restoration through performance. I looked at her tear-stained face, her trembling hands, and the absolute naked terror in her eyes. I searched myself carefully and honestly for pity, or compassion, or even the mild discomfort of watching someone suffer. What I found was none of those things. What I found was a profound, steady, chilling sense of total and complete vindication, the particular quality of satisfaction that belongs specifically to a person who spent years being told they were nothing by someone who had nothing, and who had the patience and the capability and the will to wait until the moment when the truth of both assessments was undeniable. With a slow, deliberate, and entirely graceful motion, I took a single step backward. The fine silk of my evening gown slipped smoothly and completely out of Patricia's frantic grasp. She released a sharp sound of shock and lunged forward immediately, her hands clawing at the empty space where the fabric had been with an urgency that produced nothing. She never made contact. Before Patricia's outstretched hands could close the distance, Gideon moved with the same quiet, practiced efficiency he had demonstrated throughout the entire evening. He did not rush. He did not perform aggression or display force. He simply stepped forward. One smooth, silent, entirely purposeful motion, and positioned his massive, broad-shouldered frame directly between Patricia and me, with the absolute structural completeness of an immovable physical barrier. He looked down at her with an expression of complete dispassionate indifference. He issued no verbal instruction. He produced no threat. His presence alone communicated, with perfect and inescapable clarity, that the space around me was no longer accessible to her under any circumstances. Patricia's access to me had been permanently and comprehensively revoked. She was no longer permitted to touch me, to appeal to me, or to address me in any capacity, without navigating a wall of highly trained, completely impassive executive protection that was not susceptible to tears, to social pressure, to claims of family connection, or to anything else she might attempt to deploy. Patricia slumped forward onto the cold marble tiles with the complete, total weight of someone from whom every available form of resistance has been simultaneously withdrawn. She pressed her palms against the floor, staring up at the polished leather of Gideon's shoes, her chest heaving in the shallow, ragged rhythm of a person who has finally run entirely out of road. The elite patrons of the Oakwood Country Club watched in complete, unbroken silence, the absorbed, motionless attention of people witnessing something that will serve as a reference point in their understanding of consequence for the rest of their lives. I stood safely and completely behind Gideon's towering presence. I looked at what remained of the family I had married into. The broken, wrecked remnants scattered across the expensive dining room of the club they had used as a stage for their performance of status and authority for so many years. I felt no guilt. I felt no ambivalence. I felt no residual tenderness or grief for what might have been if different choices had been made. What I felt was a profound, settled, deeply satisfying cold justice, the specific satisfaction of a person who built something carefully, who understood it completely, and who watched it perform exactly as designed. I stepped partially to the side of Gideon's frame, precisely enough to ensure that Patricia had a clear and unobstructed view of my face as I delivered the final words she would ever hear from me. "Patricia," I said. My voice moved through the silent room with a calm, carrying authority that required no elevation and no theatrical weight. It simply arrived, everywhere, completely. You spent the last several years of your life demanding my submission and my deference as though they were obligations I was born into when I married your son. You circled this dining room and every room like it, performing the role of a woman whose bloodline and breeding entitled her to the absolute obedience of everyone below her. Which, in your assessment, was everyone. You belittled my background at every available opportunity. You mocked my career as something menial and embarrassing. You looked your wealthy friends directly in their eyes and described me, with pride and without a moment of hesitation, as a useless, uneducated computer repair girl not worthy of sitting at your table. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut. Fresh tears escaped from beneath her eyelashes and traced paths down her ruined face. She shook her head with a slow, weak motion that communicated nothing so much as the complete and final absence of any remaining response. She had no defense. There was none available. You were entirely, comprehensively wrong about me, I continued, ensuring that every executive, every socialite, every influential and powerful person in that room heard the complete truth of what I was. I am not a computer repair girl. I am the architect of your complete and inescapable ruin. I designed a digital fortress of such sophistication that your arrogant, overconfident son walked through what he believed was a breach in my defenses, and instead delivered the entirety of his criminal operation directly into the hands of the federal prosecutors, who will now spend the next several years of his life deciding exactly what it was worth. You brought this upon yourselves with absolute thoroughness. You chose to engage in high-stakes games of financial manipulation and corporate extortion with a woman you had spent years telling yourselves was beneath your notice, and tonight you lost everything you had, which, as it turns out, was everything you had taken from me. I paused. The silence held with the particular, total quality that belongs to the moment after something permanent has been said. I formally and permanently sever every connection between myself and this family, I declared, allowing the words to carry the weight and finality of a legal instrument rather than an emotional statement, because that was precisely what they were. You will never have access to my accounts, my properties, or my company. You will never again be associated with anything I own or operate or represent. You are cut off, completely, permanently, and without the possibility of revision. You are dead to me, Patricia, and I say that without anger. I say it as a statement of simple, administrative fact. I shifted my gaze across the table to Brandon. The federal agents had secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs and were maintaining their physical support of him at his upper arms, given that his legs appeared to be providing only intermittent and unreliable structural assistance. He was trembling with a visible, full-body tremor. His face was a sickly, washed-out white, his eyes wide and hollow with a terror that had evacuated every other quality from his expression. He looked at me with the final, silent, pathetic appeal of a man who has no remaining options and is directing the energy of his desperation at the last available target, however irrational the hope. I offered him a single, slow, unhurried smile. It contained nothing warm. It contained nothing cruel. It contained only the absolute, settled, complete certainty of an outcome that was already fully determined and required nothing further from me. I will see you in federal court, Brandon, I said, my voice carrying the quiet, lethal certainty of a promise that will be kept. I strongly recommend retaining exceptional legal representation. You are going to require something considerably beyond competent. The lead agent gave a single, curt, professional nod. Let's go, he said, turning Brandon with a firm, practiced grip toward the main exit. The walk began. Brandon was escorted through the exclusive dining room of the Oakwood Country Club with his hands secured behind his back, his expensive leather shoes finding uncertain, dragging purchase against the polished floor. He was walked directly past the tables of the executives and socialites and prominent professionals he had spent the most productive years of his life attempting to impress and be accepted by. The very people whose regard had been the entire point of the performance he had been giving for as long as he could remember. They watched him pass with expressions that occupied the full spectrum between genuine shock, barely contained moral satisfaction, and the particular, fascinated disgust that belongs to witnessing someone's constructed identity dissolve publicly and completely. Brandon kept his head angled toward the floor, incapable of sustaining eye contact with any of them, as the alternating red and blue light from the federal vehicles waiting in the driveway painted his humiliated, diminished face in its unambiguous, rhythmic declaration of what he had become. Back at the table, in the aftermath of his departure, the devastation was complete and absolute. Audrey remained collapsed in her mahogany dining chair, her face buried entirely in her trembling hands, her shoulders moving in the small, rapid, involuntary convulsions of someone crying with a depth and a desperation that has moved well beyond performance into something genuine and overwhelming. Jamal was gone. Her marriage had been formally and publicly ended. Her joint accounts were being frozen by legal instruments she could not contest and could not circumvent. She was facing a mountain of accumulated debt, the full weight of a theft prosecution, and a lifestyle that had been funded entirely by resources that were now permanently and irrevocably unavailable to her. With no income of her own sufficient to sustain even a modest fraction of the life she had believed was her permanent entitlement. The golden child had been stripped of her unearned crown in the most public and comprehensive manner available, and she had been left alone, entirely alone, to navigate the catastrophic consequences of choices that had seemed, in the making, like simply taking what she deserved. And Patricia remained on the floor. The proud, imperious, relentlessly performing matriarch, who had opened the evening by demanding my most precious possession and threatening me with destitution, was now a ruined, penniless woman, crying quietly against the expensive marble tiles of a club that would be revoking her membership before the end of the week. Her social reputation, the thing she had organized her entire existence around constructing and protecting and performing, had been permanently and publicly obliterated in front of the precise and specific audience whose opinion she had valued above everything else, including truth, including decency, and including the people who had loved her enough to fund her illusions at considerable personal cost. There would be no recovery from this. The Oakwood Country Club would remove her access. Her wealthy friends would sever contact with the speed and efficiency of people whose own reputations require them to maintain a safe distance from obvious, documented failure. She would be left to face whatever came next entirely on her own, with no financial resources, no social standing, and no remaining performance to hide behind. The fake empire had burned to its foundations. What remained was nothing but settling, cooling ash. I turned my back on all of it. I did not spare a single glance backward at the wreckage I left behind among the mahogany tables and the crystal chandeliers of the Oakwood Country Club. I did not need to look back. I had seen everything I needed to see, and I had confirmed everything I had always known. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had settled onto my chest at some indeterminate point during my marriage, the weight of performing smallness for people who needed me to be small, of absorbing cruelty from people who depended on my patience, of funding the comfort of people who despised me for being the source of it, lifted with a completeness that felt almost physical as I moved through the dining room. What replaced it was a clean, electric, genuine aliveness that I had not felt in longer than I wanted to calculate. I moved through the space with my head at its natural height, my posture carrying the quiet authority of someone who has nothing remaining to perform or justify or explain. The wealthy patrons pulled back from my path with an instinctive, involuntary deference. Chairs shifted forward, bodies pressed against tables, the physical crowd parting with the same natural, gravity-governed motion that spaces grant to things with sufficient and obvious mass. They watched me pass with expressions that contained, in various proportions, a genuine wariness, and something that looked very much like the particular respect that belongs to finally, clearly seeing something that had been present all along and consistently underestimated. Gideon followed a precise half-step behind me, his presence ensuring that my exit was as unimpeded and as complete as every other aspect of the evening had been. We stepped through the heavy double doors and out into the crisp, clean evening air. The rhythmic red and blue light of the federal vehicles was already a diminishing presence in the distance, carrying my husband toward the beginning of his new and considerably less comfortable reality. The night air reached my face with the quality of something that had been waiting patiently to be noticed, and was now, finally, given the opportunity. The valet brought my vehicle forward without delay, a sleek, matte black, heavily armored luxury SUV that reflected the ambient city light in the particular, understated way that things built for genuine function rather than performance tend to. Gideon opened the rear door. I settled into the plush leather interior with the complete ease of someone returning to a space that belongs entirely to them. The engine's quiet, powerful hum offered a sensory counterpoint of extraordinary quality to the hysterical, fracturing sounds I had just left behind. Gideon closed the door with the solid, definitive sound of something being properly sealed, and took his place in the front passenger seat as my driver navigated us smoothly down the winding, immaculately maintained driveway of the country club. I leaned back against the headrest. Through the tinted bulletproof glass, the city lights moved past in long, blurred horizontal lines. The illuminated skyline of the place I had built something in, from nothing, on my own terms, for my own reasons. The full magnitude of the evening's conclusion settled slowly into my chest with the quality of something earned rather than received. I had done what I came to do. I had removed a malignant and carefully concealed threat from my life, protected everything I had spent years building, and in doing so had given one genuinely good man the truth about his own situation before it cost him everything irreplaceable. The years of absorbing Patricia's relentless performative contempt, Audrey's reflexive, entitled cruelty, and Brandon's pathetic, fragile, sustained condescension, they were concluded. Not paused, not temporarily interrupted, concluded. The drive through the financial district to my building was swift and entirely peaceful. We entered the secure subterranean parking structure, bypassing the public lobby. I stepped into my private biometric elevator and pressed my fingerprint to the sensor. The doors closed. The elevator ascended with quiet, efficient speed, carrying me upward through the building toward the top of the skyline. When the doors opened directly into the foyer of my penthouse, I stepped into a scene of coordinated, precise, focused activity. My personal logistics team and a bonded moving crew had been deployed while I was at the country club. While I had been dismantling Brandon's constructed reality across a dining table in the Oakwood Country Club, my staff had been methodically and thoroughly erasing his physical presence from my home. The main living area was alive with purposeful movement. Workers in matching uniforms were boxing his designer suits, his collection of luxury watches accumulated at my expense, his golf clubs purchased on my corporate accounts, the decorative and personal items that had gradually colonized a space that had never been his. They moved with the precise, organized efficiency of people executing a well-prepared plan, ensuring with careful attention that nothing belonging to me was inadvertently removed in the process. My lead estate manager approached with a digital tablet and provided a brief, thorough update. Every item belonging to Brandon had been cataloged, photographed for complete legal documentation purposes, and secured in heavy-duty transport crates. The crates were being transferred to a climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of the city, with 1 month of fees prepaid in full. After that 30-day window, the ongoing storage costs would become Brandon's personal and sole financial responsibility to manage, an irony I appreciated in a quiet and complete way. I nodded my approval and moved through the space with the particular ease of someone reclaiming territory that has always been theirs. The penthouse felt different already. Lighter, more breathable, more genuinely mine, in a way that I had not been aware was missing until it was fully, suddenly, and completely restored. The air itself seemed cleaner. I walked to the custom-built wine cellar adjacent to the kitchen and spent a quiet, unhurried moment selecting a rare vintage Bordeaux that I had been specifically reserving for an occasion worthy of it. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass and carried it down the corridor toward my primary suite, continuing past the master bedroom and into my home office. The heavy oak door, the prop that Brandon had been so proud of defeating, closed behind me with its familiar, satisfying magnetic click. I set the wine glass on the desk positioned before the floor-to-ceiling windows and faced my own reflection in the dark glass. The city stretched out beyond it in every direction, illuminated, indifferent, and entirely available. I raised my hands to my collarbone and found the silver clasp of the sapphire and diamond necklace by feel. With a smooth, practiced motion, I unhooked it and lowered it into my open palm. The deep blue gem caught the ambient glow of the city below the window and returned it with a quiet, steady, unhurried brilliance. The recording device concealed within its silver casing had performed its function with complete and flawless precision, capturing, in Brandon's own enthusiastic voice, every element of the criminal confession required to ensure that the federal case against him would be inescapably complete. I opened the velvet-lined jewelry box on my desk and placed the necklace inside with care. I secured the lid. My mother's most cherished legacy had not been stolen. It had not been worn around someone else's neck as a costume prop for a performance she would never have recognized or approved. It had been used instead as the precise and perfect instrument of my liberation from the people who had believed, incorrectly and at considerable eventual cost to themselves, that they could take it from me. I lifted my wine glass. The Bordeaux carried the complex, layered quality of something that has been allowed to develop fully and at its own pace, and I held it for a moment before drinking. Then I opened my laptop, brought up my company's secure operational dashboard, and watched the familiar, illuminated streams of data arrange themselves across the screen. The toxic architecture that had been built around me, piece by piece, year by year, had been completely and permanently dismantled. What remained was what had always been there, underneath it: the work, the independence, the capability, and the absolute freedom of a person who has no remaining obligations to people who never deserved them. The next frontier was waiting. It always had been. The saga of Olivia and her precisely engineered reckoning with a manipulative family serves as a genuinely instructive illustration of what self-worth, preparation, and patient clarity are actually capable of producing. If there is a single enduring lesson to extract from this story of cold and methodical justice, it is that true and durable power resides in absolute financial and emotional independence, not in the performance of it, but in its actual, structural reality. Toxic individuals like Patricia, Brandon, and Audrey sustain themselves by constructing and maintaining illusions. They deploy gaslighting, coordinated social pressure, and manufactured prestige as the primary tools of control, relying on their target's fear of public conflict and social consequence to compel the submission they require. They expect you to make yourself smaller, to apologize for your success, to quietly redirect your hard-earned resources toward the preservation of their fabricated comfort. Olivia's story demonstrates that the precise moment you stop playing within the rules of a system designed to exploit you, the entire architecture of that system reveals itself for what it has always been, a performance entirely dependent on your continued participation. She did not win by screaming the loudest or striking the first blow. She won because she had quietly, methodically, and with complete thoroughness built an independent structure of such genuine strength that the people who thought they were attacking her position were, in every meaningful sense, attacking themselves. The story also illuminates something critical about the nature of boundaries. Olivia's financial resources were a tool, but her actual defining weapon was her unbreakable self-respect. Her refusal to accept a definition of her worth that originated with people who had never genuinely seen her. When confronted with extortion, theft, and deliberate and sustained cruelty, she did not seek reconciliation or negotiate a more comfortable form of the same arrangement. She built an exit, and she walked through it completely. We must each learn to recognize when a relationship has become purely transactional, when the people in it see us not as human beings but as resources to be managed and extracted. And we must find the courage to leave that arrangement carrying everything we arrived with and everything we built while we were there. You do not owe your success, your peace, your time, or your resources to people who have decided, for their own convenience, that you are nothing more than a stepping stone beneath their ambitions. Protect what you have built. Secure your independence with the same care and seriousness you would bring to anything else worth keeping. And never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to make you feel small inside a life that you constructed yourself, with your own intelligence and your own labor and your own irreplaceable time. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that setting a firm boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of profound and necessary self-respect.